The weirdest thing about ancient history is that it had its own ancient history. It didn't all just happen at once in some vague ancient before time. History was just as subject to the linear progression of time as we are now, and that means even if two events both happened in ancient history, they could still be separated by a nearly unfathomable gulf. Cleopatra was born 2,500 years after the Great Pyramids, despite the fact that 2,000 more years of hindsight turned them both into staples of the tropes of ancient Egypt, a vaguely defined Uchronia instead of 3,000 years of human lives and cultural change. The opener to the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story written down 5,000 years ago, brags about how the tale dates back to ancient days. This kind of thing makes sense, but it doesn't feel right. History gets compressed with hindsight into this big, vague monolith of tropes and cliches, and when we get reminded that unfathomably ancient people had their own unfathomably ancient past to reckon with, it just makes that unfathomable ancientness double unfathomable and way more complicated. It's more comfortable to think of ancient history like a big sandbox where everybody was doing everything all at once for all the fun crossover potential and anachronisms we could ever want. Egyptian gods versus Norse gods? What's a 1,000-year time gap between pantheons anyway? And even though the world of myth is less bound to the confines of linear time than the world of actual history, there are still internal subdivisions, disparate eras and generations of heroes that were, in the internal lore of the stories, completely separate. And this can be very easy to lose sight of. For instance, when we look back at all the big names in ancient Greece, thanks to crossovers and underworld hangouts and constant story-within-a-story references to one another, it's not immediately obvious that these towering figures of myth and legend were frequently legends even to each other. There are timelines and bloodlines and family trees that conclusively separate these big names into disparate ages. And you know what? It's about time someone went through and put them in order. So today, to borrow a strategy from Blue's 3-hour Roman history mega feature, I'm gonna go back through 9 years worth of my Greek myth videos. Oh, I wasn't as ready for that as I thought I was. And we're gonna lay them all out on a timeline. A very big timeline. And we're kicking things off with a bang, with, well, not exactly the biggest names, not the great city founders or the monster slayers or the war heroes. In fact, we can affectionately refer to this first generation of notable characters as the Cautionary Tales. It's an unfortunate truth that some people, both fictional and otherwise, end up being defined pretty much exclusively by one noteworthy part of their life. Actors defined by single roles, artists by single works, public figures by single scandals, characters by single qualities. This is often very reductive, taking a complex and nuanced figure and flattening them into a simple caricature of themselves. People are always more complicated than the stories about them. But when the person in question is primarily known for their eternal punishment in the underworld, we can safely assume they got up to some shit. So let's talk about Tantalus and how exactly this ancient Greek mythical king got himself one of the most iconic afterlife punishments in the history of Hades. So Tantalus is a demigod son of Zeus, which is at this point about as exclusive as being left-handed. And not only is he a demigod, he's a really beloved one. The Olympians like and respect him a lot as a king, a friend, and a gracious host. Or at least they did until the incident. Now, what exactly the incident was varies depending on who you ask. The generally accepted telling is that one day Zeus and the other gods came over for dinner, and Tantalus, ever the dutiful host, decided that the best way to honor the gods would be to sacrifice something important to him. So he kills his son, Pelops, and cooks him for dinner. Now, there's no explanation given as to why he thought this was a good idea, because if ancient Greece had a top-tier taboo, it was killing family members, and if it had a second-string taboo, it was cannibalism. Each one is already bad. Doubling down just seems double bad. So the gods figure out that's a human person and refuse to eat. Except for Demeter, who's not really paying attention because she's still super bummed out about Persephone ditching her for the underworld 6 months of the year, so she fails to read the room and absentmindedly eats some Pelops' shoulder. Happens to the best of us, I'm sure. Anywho, the gods are very upset with Tantalus, so they give him a stern talking to, teach him the error of his ways, and I'm just kidding. Obviously, they throw him into Tartarus. So they trap him in a pool under a fruit tree. Whenever he tries to drink the water, it recedes, and if he tries to reach the fruit, it pulls away, leaving him perpetually hungry and thirsty with relief always just out of reach. This punishment is why the word tantalizing describes this kind of situation. The gods then revive Pelops, replacing his missing shoulder with a nice ivory prosthetic, and Pelops goes on to father the House of Atreus, a long line of unfortunate Greek kings mostly known for having very tragic lives. In fact, this family later produces Agamemnon, a crime which I can only assume was later added to Tantalus's already extensive rap sheet. So this was the most well-known version of the story, but it's not the only version. In the Olympian Odes, poems dedicated to victories in the Panhellenic Olympic Games, the poet Pindar tells us, no, I know what they told you, but Pelops wasn't killed at that dinner. See, what happened was Poseidon took one look at him and got outrageously horny. So yeah, in this version, Pelops is carried off to Olympus for appropriately ancient Greek reasons, and this produces a rumor that he was killed even though he's actually fine. Tantalus is still sent to Tartarus in this version, but this time it's because when the gods have him over for dinner, he steals ambrosia and nectar, which is a violation of the laws of hospitality and one of those things you got in a lot of trouble for in ancient Greece. Zeus, along with all the flashy weather stuff, is also the god of hospitality, so violating that had a tendency to get one smote with extreme prejudice. Anyway, Tantalus gets dunked on, and meanwhile, Pelops decides he wants to marry this lady, Hippodamia, and he has to win a chariot race to do that. So he goes to Poseidon and is like, hey man, can you do me a solid because we banged that one time? And Poseidon's like, hell yeah, and lends him a really fast chariot so he wins the race. And I gotta say, I don't think there's a ballsier power move than getting a major deity you banged one time to be your wingman. So overall, Tantalus' crimes include family murdering, attempted cannibalism, violating the laws of hospitality by stealing from his host, and subjecting the ancient world to Agamemnon. That's pretty bad stuff, but does he really deserve his eternal torment in the underworld? Yes, and I'll tell you why. It's not Agamemnon. In one little-known myth, he and his buddy Pandarius, who was blessed by Demeter to never get indigestion, not a joke, conspire to steal a magic golden dog that was created by Hephaestus to guard baby Zeus. A dog made by Hephaestus, who is Zeus's son, that guarded Zeus as a baby. That dog was created by Hephaestus to guard Zeus, who was a baby at the time. Okay, so there's like 5 absurdities in that story, but the point is Tantalus stole a dog. Who does that? He deserves whatever he gets. So yeah, Tantalus is the grandfather of Atreus, and therefore the great-grandfather of Agamemnon and Menelaus, who will appear later when we get to the Trojan War. This is a pretty solid indicator of his place in the timeline, and the story also lays down a few important cultural taboos. Familicide and cannibalism are categorical no-nos. This is good stuff to know. And Tantalus' family continues to provide this invaluable cultural service of educating the world on what not to do when we get to the tale of Tantalus' daughter, Niobe. When will these people learn not to piss off the gods? Okay, the story of Niobe is very short, and like most Greek tragedies, is an essay on the folly of hubris. But for context, we're gonna need the story of Leto and her twin children, Artemis and Apollo. Yeah, you already know who they are, but their mom is more important in this story, so bear with me. So way back when, the goddess Leto had a fling with Zeus and got pregnant. Hera obviously objected, but because she couldn't do her normal solution and kill Leto, she instead decided to make her life really hard. So she put out some rules. Leto could totally give birth, she just couldn't do it on the mainland, on an island, or anywhere under the sun. And apparently Olympus counted too? Whatever. So Leto found this tiny barren rock called Delos, which wasn't the mainland and didn't count as an island, and set up to give birth. Some versions also say that Hera kidnapped Alethea, the goddess of childbirth, to keep Leto from having her kids, but any mother will tell you that nothing stops the baby when it wants to get out, so Leto had her children anyway. First Artemis, and then 9 days later, Apollo. So now that we've got some backstory, let's talk about Niobe. So Niobe, queen of Thebes, has a loving husband, Amphion, and 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters. Life is pretty sweet. Now Leto has a temple in Thebes, and she's requested that the women of Thebes pay her some respect via incense, pretty much standard godly fare. Well, Niobe shows up to do her thing, and apparently decides that the best way to worship Leto is to try and one-up her. So Niobe claims that, hey, she managed to have 14 kids while Leto only had 2, so who's the real goddess? Well, evidently Leto, as the minute she hears that particular gem, she calls up the twins and asks him to show Niobe who's boss. So Artemis and Apollo gear up and start sniping Niobe's kids, killing all of them. Then her husband kills himself. Sucks to be you, Niobe. Sounds like your mouth was writing checks your nuclear family couldn't cash. Then she turns into a rock. The end. Now, we'll get back to the House of Atreus later, but before then, we've got one more early stop in the don't be like this idiot mythospace, and it's none other than Sisyphus, a man who presumably saw Tantalus' eternal punishment in Hades for violating the laws of hospitality and diagnosed him with a skill issue. Rip to you guys, but he's just built different. Hey, any of you ever read Sandman? For the purposes of this explanation, I'm gonna pretend you haven't. The precipitating event in the first comic volume is that this guy tries to capture Death in order to become immortal. He missed and got her brother Dream instead, which was good, not for Dream obviously, but for everybody else. See, capturing Death always has consequences, usually of the nobody dies variety, which is never as much fun as it sounds. Now, personifying Death is already a weird concept, especially since Death is just the incredibly complex and delicate machinery that drives us, suffering an unrecoverable error. Turning that concept into a person is kind of a leap, but at the very least it's a leap that was taken a very long time ago, although it's not actually culturally universal. More common than the anthropomorphic personification of death is the concept of the psychopomp, a spirit meant to guide already dead souls to the requisite afterlife. Now, Greek mythology has its fair share of psychopomps, the word is even Greek in origin, but it also has a personification of death, the god Thanatos. Now, Thanatos wasn't the most well-liked deity, mostly because people get a little put off by the constant reminders of their own mortality. But we should always remember that just because we don't like the job someone's doing, doesn't mean we shouldn't be grateful the job's being done. This is the story of Sisyphus capturing Death. So let's talk about Sisyphus. He's mostly known for his eternal punishment in Hades, which is a sure sign that he's going to be a real character in life. See, Sisyphus is a king, but more importantly, he's also a terrible host, as he's made a habit of murdering his guests in their sleep and taking all their stuff. This is obviously a gross violation of the laws of hospitality, which were kind of a big deal in ancient Greece, and the gods collectively decide that something must be done about this. Hades suggests that they just kill him and move on, points for efficiency, and the gods agree that that's probably the easiest solution. So Hades calls up Thanatos and tells him to bring Sisyphus in, but he warns him that Sisyphus is really clever, and might think of a way to escape. So, just in case, Hades gives him a special set of chains to bind Sisyphus' spirit and ensure that he can't get away. So Thanatos zips on over to Sisyphus' castle and looms ominously until Sisyphus acknowledges his presence. Now the problem is, Sisyphus is clever. So when he sees the specter of death looming over him with handcuffs and a grumpy expression, he thinks fast and starts oohing and ahhing over the craftsmanship of the chains. While Thanatos is distracted and more than a little confused, Sisyphus catches him by surprise and chains him up with his own shackles. Then he stuffs the captured god in a trunk and goes about his day. Now obviously Thanatos can't do his job like this, so for the next few days nothing can die, and this ends up pissing off Ares, since there's no fun in war if nobody dies from it. The gods start looking for Thanatos, but because proper detective procedure hadn't been invented yet, it takes a whole month before they think to look in his last known location. But meanwhile, Sisyphus figures out that he probably doesn't have much time before his shenanigans are discovered, so he makes his wife promise to not do the proper funerary procedures for him when he ends up dead. Shortly thereafter, Ares smashes in, busts out Thanatos, and together they jump Sisyphus and drag him down into Hades. But when they get there, Sisyphus is all, "Oh, Persephone, it's awful! My wife didn't even give me a funeral! She just tossed my body onto the street! Can you believe this?" And Persephone's like, "Oh, that's terrible, you poor thing!" and allows him to return to Earth for 3 days in order to arrange a burial, haunt his wife, etc. Now obviously, Sisyphus hops right back into his corpse, pops back indoors newly alive, and refuses to return to the underworld. Thanatos cannot be persuaded to try and recollect him, so Sisyphus lives a long, lucrative life until he dies of old age many years later, whereupon he finds himself point blank on a pissed off Persephone, a grumpy Thanatos, and a Hades approximately 110% done with his nonsense. Sisyphus is punished by being forced to roll an enormous boulder up a hill. Every time he reaches the top, the boulder falls down the hill again. Hence his punishment in death is to do something useless over and over again, in the same way that cheating death, an ultimately pointless endeavor, was his hobby in life. Fun times! Damn, I love me some pop culture references back in the day. Surely this won't keep happening. So with the era of dumbass dead guys coming to a close, a few generations come and go. And rattling around somewhere in here, we can presume, is one last clown of a king who unfortunately did not leave a family line we could use to measure exactly what generational crowd he was running with. But he did leave an actual archaeological record we can pull a few estimates out of. King Midas is legendarily credited with founding the city of Gordion, the capital of ancient Phrygia, a city that we know was established sometime around 2300 BCE. And while this is only so helpful because we don't exactly have timestamps for anyone else to compare to, we can compare this to the upcoming touchpoint of the Trojan War, which has been estimated to have happened in some form or another around the 1300s to 1100s BCE. So, if his mythical credit is to be believed, Midas is old. In fact, he could conceivably be older than everyone else we've talked about so far, since Tantalus had great-grandkids who fought in the Trojan War, and there's really no way to stretch 3 generations over 1,000 years. But realistically, realism has no place in the establishment of this timeline, and Midas is a bit of a disconnected free agent whose stories didn't start getting told until kinda late in the game, so let's park him on the timeline right around here and get to his particular flavor of cautionary tale. I love cautionary tales. And as everyone knows, the best cautionary tales are the ones with lessons that are completely inapplicable to real life. Ill-advised magical wishes, powerful sorceresses with extremely specific instructions, highly judgmental magical beings doling out punishments to the unworthy. I may be shaky at best on filing taxes and annual car maintenance, but you better believe I know what I'm not gonna wish for in the event of a surprise genie or divine boon. Now, when it comes to ill-advised wish stories, King Midas of Phrygia is probably the most well-known mythological case, and is mostly known in the mythos for being broadly very dumb. If Midas is in a myth, you better believe he's not gonna have a good time, and you better believe it will be 100% his own fault. King Midas is most well known for 2 particularly embarrassing vignettes in his career recounted in Ovid's Metamorphoses, so let's talk about him today. Now, our story begins when our sweet bacchanal boy Dionysus notices his crew of revelers and followers is apparently short one member. The elderly satyr Silenus, a drunken prophet and also Dionysus' foster father, is nowhere to be found. This is because he got super drunk and passed out in a region that happened to belong to King Midas and was captured and brought to his court. Now, fortunately for Silenus, King Midas is up to date on his Orphic Dionysian lore and recognizes him as a follower of Dionysus and honors his presence in the court with a full 10 days of feasting and revelry. When Dionysus rolls into town to pick him up, he's so happy with Midas' treatment of Silenus that he offers Midas a boon, any boon. Midas has prepared his whole life for this moment and asks Dionysus to make everything he touches turn to pure gold. Now, Dionysus may be the god of wine and drunken madness, but he knows a bad idea when he hears one. But he did promise Midas any boon, so he reluctantly agrees, and Midas is absolutely delighted by his newfound golden touch. Until dinner time, when he learns that food and drink count as part of everything and turn to gold as soon as he tries to eat. Gold is regrettably not very nutritious, and this boon situation threatens to become a very bad time very quickly. Now, fun fact, there's a popular version of this story that I actually referenced in an earlier video, where Midas accidentally turns his daughter to gold. But as far as I can tell, that version was invented in 1851 by American author Nathaniel Hawthorne and isn't referenced any earlier than that, which is a shame because it's a pretty gnarly twist. In Ovid's version, at least, Midas doesn't need any more motivation than hunger to realize that this particular wish was ill-advised and beg Dionysus to help him. Dionysus directs him to the river Pactolus and tells him to jump in, which washes Midas clean of the gift turned curse, and as a fun bonus, loads the river full of rich gold deposits, which was actually true. The Pactolus was loaded with electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver that the Lydian Iron Age culture used to make the first coins in history. Thanks, Midas. Now Midas, free of his curse and the consequences of his actions, has had enough of gold and riches for a while and decides to relax and unwind by living alone in the woods, which coincidentally is where the wilderness god Pan likes to hang out with his Pan posse. Pan is in fact playing on his Pan pipes, having a grand old time when he gets super into the moment and boasts that his music is so good it's even better than Apollo's. Now Apollo is never one to pass up an opportunity for some petty conflict, so he zorps down to the mountain to challenge this bold claim, and he and Pan declare an official competition, with Tmolus, god of the mountain, serving as an impartial judge. Pan cuts loose on the Pan pipes and plays a beautiful rustic melody, which is very nice and charming, but Apollo's classically trained and also the literal god of music, and his lyre playing is straight up breathtaking, so Tmolus declares Apollo the better musician. Everyone is pretty happy with this outcome, except for Midas, who's been listening in, fails to read the room, and decides to play Satyr's advocate by declaring that he thinks Pan is actually the better player. Apollo's like, if this chump really believes that, he must be rocking some donkey ears or something, and the raw power of that sick nasty burn physically transforms Midas's normal human ears into donkey ears. Midas hides those bad boys under a big turban so nobody finds out the truth or questions him for anything beyond dubious fashion choices, but he can't hide from his barber, who stalwartly keeps it a secret from everyone, but eventually gets so pent up that he goes out, digs a hole, whispers the truth into the hole, and then buries it, which sounds like something you'd get recommended in therapy and would probably have been totally harmless if it hadn't caused reeds to grow from that spot that whispered the secret whenever the wind blew through them. Truly hilarious. We need more plants like this. Leaving behind us an age of cultural cautionary tales and founder kings, we reach an age of monster slayers. And this is fun, because the very first miscellaneous myth video I ever made was about arguably the best of these monster slayers, Perseus, founder of Mycenae and the future great-grandfather of Heracles. Don't worry, we'll get to him, and don't worry too much about the generational timescale either. Myths are still myths, and the time frame doesn't have to make the most sense. For now, let's dive back 8 whole years and then a few thousand more to see what Perseus got up to. So, this is the first video in what'll probably be a longish series of miscellaneous myths. Now initially, I'll primarily be focusing on Greek mythology, as it's one of the mythologies that's been more influential to popular culture in the past millennia or so. But I think we all know how bad I am at staying focused on one subject at a time, so we might roam pretty far afield in this series. Don't get disoriented if we leave off in Thebes and start up again in Central America. Now, to start us off simply, I'll be covering a myth that you're probably all at least vaguely familiar with, mostly because references to it got catapulted back into popular culture within the past few years. It's the story of Perseus and Medusa. Now, as is often the case in Greek mythology, Perseus' story begins long before Perseus actually does. In fact, it begins with a prophecy. Now, this particular prophecy isn't as cushy as the last one we dealt with. In this case, the king Acrisius was told by an oracle that he was doomed to die at the hands of his grandson. Acrisius took this news about as well as you'd expect, and decided his only course of action was to lock his childless daughter Danae in an underground cell and basically leave her there to die of old age. You know, I don't often say this, but why don't you just kill her? But Zeus, who never met a mortal woman he didn't want to make sweet, sweet arrows to, spotted the beautiful Danae in her prison, and unwilling to let something like eternal solitary confinement stop him, turned himself into a rain of gold and showered himself into her cell, whereupon he made her pregnant and left. Man, isn't that just like a deity? You can bet he's not going to pay child support either. So Danae has a kid, and her dad panics because of the prophecy, and stuffs her and the kid into a trunk and throws it into the ocean. Jesus! With the kind of father figures this kid has, it's going to be a miracle if he doesn't grow up to be a psychopath. So Danae and her son, whose name, as you've probably already guessed, is Perseus, drift ashore on the tiny island of Seriphus, where they're taken in by a childless fisherman and his wife. So Perseus grows up with 3 parents and 1 absentee godfather, and his life is pretty chill. Until the king, Polydictes, decides that Perseus' mom has got it going on, and decides to make her marry him. However, Danae refuses, and Polydictes is too scared of Perseus to press the issue. So, like any sane ruler, he decides to get Perseus out of the way by by sending the lad on a quest that'll almost certainly kill him, and that way he'll be able to get with Danae without any interference. Polydictes convinces Perseus to go out and slay the Gorgon Medusa, a woman who had once been beautiful, but after she and Poseidon got busy in one of Athena's temples, she was cursed by the goddess to have badass snake hair and also be so hideous as to turn anyone who looks at her into stone. Modern interpretations usually make her super hot anyway, but hey, whatever. So Perseus, young, hot, and full of crippling naivete, ventures out into the great wide world to find him a deadly Gorgon. However, thanks to some divine nepotism, he's given a leg up by the various Greek gods, who give him some magic items to make the quest actually possible. Hermes gives him a sword and his winged sandals, and Athena gives him the mirror shield, because apparently petrifying ugliness only petrifies you if you look at it head on. Then they tell him that he needs to visit the Grey Sisters in order to find out where the Gorgons actually live. So he scoots on over there and gets the Grey Sisters to tell him where the Medusa lives by holding their eyeball hostage. It makes just as much sense in context. Anyway, after marking the location on his map, Perseus goes to the next quest marker, which happens to be the Garden of Hera, who's oddly cool with his presence, despite her typical reaction to Zeus's kids. Anyway, the nymphs of the garden give Perseus a sack to hold Medusa's head and a magic helmet to make him invisible.
Magic helmet.
Magic helmet.
Magic helmet.
Guess which one of those is probably going to be more useful?
Magic helmet.
Now, I wish I could tell you that Perseus and Medusa had some awesome final showdown, maybe with lightning and rains of fire or something, but Perseus is a pragmatic hero, so he sneaks in while Medusa's asleep and chops off her head. Well, that was easy. But this myth is missing something. Well, a few things, actually. Where's the drama? The final showdown? Could we maybe throw in a princess or something? Ask and ye shall receive. As Perseus is flying home, he spots a beautiful princess, whose name is Andromeda, chained to a rock by the ocean. When he pops down to ask her what's up, she tells him that her mother managed to piss off the ocean itself, and it sent a sea monster to ravage the land. They can only make it stop if they sacrifice Andromeda. Now, Perseus does what any red-blooded Greco-Roman hero would do and vows to slay the sea monster and save the princess. And he does. Okay, fine. Perseus flies around the thrashing beast, frantically dodging as it does its absolute best to swallow the young prince whole. But Perseus is too nimble for the cumbersome creature and wears down its defenses little by little until finally, the monster lays slain at his feet. Happy? So Perseus returns home to Polydictes and delivers the Medusa's head to him, unsurprisingly petrifying him and his entire court of bad guys in one fell swoop. Then he and Andromeda get married, the fisherman who saved him as a baby becomes king, and everyone ends up happy. Oh, but what about the prophecy? Well, see, a few years later, King Acrisius visits the basically Olympics in the city of Larissa, whereupon Perseus accidentally beans him with a discus. The end. I'm being so chill and normal about my old art and my old narration, but what's really killing me is my old inability to balance audio correctly. Anyway, after Perseus took the gold medal and not dying a horrible hubristic death, he sadly did not leave enough medals for anybody else, and the next crop of heroes didn't do so hot in the happy endings department. So let's go from my oldest Greek hero video to my newest one, and real quick talk about Cadmus. I wonder when the happy ending was invented. The fairy tale trope, yo weirdos. It has this appealing vagueness to it that lets us just believe our heroes ride off into the sunset and experience some sort of idyllic just reward for all their troubles, nice and off-screen so we can't see any details that might spoil the illusion. It just feels like every time I unpack an ancient myth, we get a good hard look at the protagonist's entire life, from their storybook acts of great heroism down to their inevitable horrifying tragic end, frequently due to their own shitty behavior during those aforementioned acts of heroism. Sure, some of them get deified in the process, but that's kinda cold comfort. Then again, I guess it's more realistic than nebulous retirement ever after. Greek heroes live interesting lives, and that, quite frankly, never ends well. One of the greats that I've managed to overlook so far is Cadmus, founder hero of Thebes and frequent co-star in the family trees of a truly impressive number of characters we've talked about before. This version of his story comes to us in Ovid's Metamorphoses, and I cannot wait to hear about how his life goes horribly wrong thanks to the unjust capriciousness of the gods. Ovid doesn't have a brand, what are you talking about? Our story begins at the end of another one. As we briefly touched on in the Zodiac video, Phoenician Princess Europa has had the unfortunate but tragically common experience of being abducted by Zeus, cunningly disguised as a bull, who carries her across the ocean to the shores of Crete and emplaces her as its first queen. But in a shocking exploration of the canonically acknowledged shittiness of Zeus's actions, she leaves behind a confused and grieving family, notably a father who demands that she must be found. He sends Europa's brother Cadmus in search of her and raises the stakes by demanding that Cadmus return with his sister or not at all. Unfortunately, due to the aforementioned godly abduction, not at all is going to be his only option. Cadmus seeks out the Oracle at Delphi and asks for her help, and she tells him that his main quest line is softlock, but what he's gonna do instead is he's gonna find this magic cow, right, and follow it across the land until it decides to lie down, and there he's gonna establish a great kingdom and name it Boeotia. Cadmus heads out and immediately finds a beautiful and clearly magical cow, and does as the Oracle commands, following it on a very long journey until it settles down for a rest in a lush, empty stretch of land ripe for the colonizing. Cadmus sends his followers out to find a source of fresh water so he can make some sacrifices to the gods. Followers who have of course been here the whole time because of how profoundly important they are to the story, with long and successful careers ahead of them just down this river and inside this spooky cave. When the sun starts setting and Cadmus's guys aren't back yet, he goes to investigate and finds that, horror of horrors, those followers of his have been slaughtered to a man, and they were so important. The cause of their death quickly becomes clear, as emerging from the spooky cave is a giant venomous dragon ready to fight. What follows is a battle of epic proportions where Cadmus uses such cunning strategies as throwing a rock at it and stabbing it real good. After a cataclysmic duel, Cadmus successfully slays the dragon and takes a moment to bask in his victory, which is when a spooky voice rings out and tells him if he thinks slaying dragons is funny, his future is about to be hilarious. Before he really has time to mull that one over, Athena pops into the story and tells him he needs manpower thanks to the aforementioned tragic and horrible death of all his followers, so he'd better get busy taking that dragon's teeth and sowing them like seeds. Cadmus obeys because when Athena tells you to do a thing, you do it, and the dragon's teeth sprout into a veritable army of warriors, fully decked out and ready to fight. And fight they do. Immediately. Each other. The army of draconic warriors just straight up start throwing hands, setting some sort of speedrun record for fastest time between birth and first murder that has been matched except by certain species of parasitic wasp. But as quickly as the battle has begun, it's over, with 5 warriors remaining with the wherewithal to notice that, hey, wait a second, this entire fight is pointless. So they stop, pledge allegiance to a probably mildly scarred Cadmus, and set about building that great city of his. And then we skip forward in time through Cadmus's marriage to Harmonia, the daughter of Aphrodite and Ares, and they start a family together, which handily segues into a quick montage of all of Cadmus's descendants who died horrible, painful deaths because Hera is still mad about the Europa thing. Big names like his grandson Actaeon and his daughter Semele, with a special detour into a fun new story where Cadmus's daughter Ino and her husband Athamas are attacked by the Fury Tisiphone and driven mad by magical venomous snakes, causing Athamas to kill one of their infant sons and drive Ino and their surviving child to leap into the sea to escape him. But thanks to a special act of divine nepotism courtesy of Aphrodite, Poseidon transforms Ino and her son into ocean gods with fun new names and everything. No harm done, all's well that ends well, good thing they had that spare kid lying around. But of course Cadmus has no way of knowing about that last part, so from his perspective, his children and grandchildren have just been suffering horrible fates non-stop with no reprieve. He wonders if it might be because that dragon he killed was more than just a monster. What if it was sacred to the gods, and by killing it he angered them somehow? He says, hypothetically, if that were the case, it would be better if the gods just bit the bullet and turned him into a dragon. And somebody's clearly listening, because they oblige. Cadmus begins transforming into a big old monster snake, feet first and slow enough that he knows exactly what's going on and that he can't stop it. Which is, yeah, horrifying. But in fairness, what are the gods gonna do? Smite me? Is probably the most blatant tempting of fate I've ever seen from a Greek hero since Jason's pro strat of what's my turbo powerful sorceress X gonna do? Murder my new wife? But as Cadmus becomes all snake all the time, his wife Harmonia grabs hold of him and double dares the gods that she bets they can't do it twice. So she also turns into a big snake, panicking all of their royal attendants. But these two dragons are very different from the one Cadmus slew back in the day because they still remember who they are and leave the palace with all the grace of royalty to spend the rest of their days in the wilderness together, which, frankly, is probably the closest thing to happily ever after a Greek hero can get. Rounding out the trio of great monster slayers is, last and arguably least, Bellerophon, who is, among other things, the grandson of Sisyphus, and I'm sure he wouldn't carry on that family legacy of being unwise around the gods. That would just be way too poignant. Let's find out together, shall we? You know, for all the popularity of anti-heroes, modern literature is remarkably black and white. Characters are either good or bad, and even if it looks like they're somewhere in the middle, you know they'll end up doing something that tips the scales one way or the other. And then there are the flawed characters, those moral paragons with 1 or 2 character quirks cracking their pedestals ever so slightly. But those flaws rarely serve to actually hurt them in any way, assuming they're even real flaws at all. Yeah, here's a hint. If the worst thing you can say about your hero is that he just likes his friends too much, that's not a character flaw. So today we'll be looking at a hero whose flaw actually was his downfall, a heroic lad by the name of Bellerophon, or Bellerophontes, depending on who you ask. So Bellerophon has the distinction of being Poseidon's son, and as a consequence is a stellar equestrian. Yeah, I'm afraid outside the world of young adult fiction, being a demigod only earns you the lamest of your deific parents' abilities, but his most prominent feature is his ability to constantly get himself exiled by pissing off the resident king. First he gets himself exiled by killing someone, either his own brother or some rando, the story is unclear, and he hikes over to King Proteus to be cleansed of the crime. But while he's there, Proteus' wife tries to seduce him, and when he's like nah, she instead accuses him of trying to seduce
her, which prompts King Proteus to kick him out. Proteus sends Bellerophon to his father-in-law, King Iobates, with a message telling the king to kill Bellerophon. Iobates takes in Bellerophon as a guest, then opens the letter and learns he's supposed to kill him instead. But unfortunately, it's against the rules of hospitality to murder your house guests, so Iobates kicks out Bellerophon and tells him to go slay the chimera that's been terrorizing his kingdom in the hopes that maybe the monster will solve his little conflict of interest. So after that needlessly complicated setup, we finally have our conflict, Bellerophon versus the chimera. Now, in case you're unfamiliar, the chimera is a fire-breathing fusion of several animals. A goat forms the body, a snake makes the tail,
and I'll form the head!
No, but seriously, she has a lion head. Dang, that reference was serendipitous. Anyway, on his way to probably die, Bellerophon bumps into a seer, Polyidus, who, continuing the trend of characters only serving to redirect the plot without actually contributing, points Bellerophon in the direction of the Temple of Athena, where he instructs the lad to go take a nap. So Bellerophon does, and while he sleeps, Athena drops a golden bridle next to him and tells him where to find the Pegasus. Now, most of you probably know what the Pegasus is, but his origins are a little wackier than you might think. Yup, even wackier than that. See, Pegasus was born from the Medusa's severed head. When our buddy Perseus cut it off, Pegasus sprang fully formed from her neck stump along with his brother Chrysaor. Now, you've probably never heard of Chrysaor, which is mostly because we barely know anything about him. His name means he who has a golden sword, and he's sometimes shown as a giant, but he's also been represented as a giant winged boar. He hardly features in any known stories, and people have cobbled together characters with his name from his grab bag of traits. Sometimes he's a winged dude with golden armor, sometimes he's a tusk monster. I don't know, man. Someone get this kid a solid characterization stat. No, not you, Saint Seiya. You had your chance. That hairstyle is unforgivable. But anyway, Pegasus, fancy winged horse, you know the drill. Bellerophon drops the bridle on him, makes an appropriate sacrifice to Poseidon, and boom, instant besties. So Bellerophon hops onto Pegasus and they fly off to the Chimera's lair. But unfortunately, the Chimera is really stupid strong and Bellerophon can't put a scratch on her. But all the fire breathing gives him an idea. He finds a large block of lead, presumably somewhere in hammer space, and sticks it to the end of his spear. Then he jams that sucker down the Chimera's throat, and when she breathes fire, it melts the lead, suffocating her. Yay? So Bellerophon scoots on back to King Iobates, who immediately sends him off to do more perilous questing in the hopes that maybe this time it'll stick. But Bellerophon cheerfully prevails over his next two challenges, defeating both the Solymi tribe and the Amazons. Iobates decides to stop screwing around and orders his guards to kill Bellerophon, but after a confusing incident involving some divine intervention from Poseidon and a whole bunch of naked women, Iobates finally gives up on trying to kill Bellerophon, reasoning that anyone that lucky has to have at least one god on his side. Iobates gives Bellerophon half his kingdom and his daughter's hand in marriage, very classic, and all seems well. But remember how I said Bellerophon has a flaw? Besides ending up with the lamest superpower ever, Bellerophon has an unfortunate tendency towards hubris, and all his victories only serve to fuel that particular fire. Eventually, Bellerophon starts wondering why he doesn't get to live on Olympus, given that he's so great and everything. Then he remembers that he has a flying horse, puts two and two together, and hops on Pegasus with destination Mount Olympus. Unfortunately, this pisses off Zeus, because apparently only he gets to indiscriminately invade other people's homes, and he sends down a gadfly, which stings Pegasus and causes the horse to throw Bellerophon off its back. Our hero plummets to earth, felled by his own hubris, or more accurately, by Zeus's hubris getting territorial. And thus ends the tale of the hero Bellerophon. He died as he lived, getting sent places by other people with no real agency of his own.
Wow, who could have foreseen that? Well, anyway, with the first stage of monster slayers over and done with, a couple more unassuming generations come and go. Now, the nice thing about these guys is the ancient Greek poets and scribes really liked laying out family trees, so we have a pretty good idea of who all of these heroes' spouses and kids were, and those lineages become one of the easiest ways we can map these big names out on a strict timeline. If we know, for example, that Perseus is the great-grandfather of Heracles, or Cadmus is the grandfather of Actaeon, that tells us pretty clearly who came first. And on that subject, Actaeon deserves a little special attention as a prime example of a good divine smiting cautionary tale.
The major well-known figures in Greek mythology are famous for all sorts of things. Heracles for his strength, Odysseus for his cunning, Atalanta for her speed and kick-ass Tarzan origin story, Tantalus and Sisyphus for their unique punishments in Hades, Clytemnestra for axe-murdering her husband. The list goes on. Some are good, some are bad, some are pretty cool, and some are frankly kind of embarrassing. I mean, nobody wants to be immortalized as that guy who got squished by a boat. Jason. But in the tumultuous annals of mytho-history, surprisingly few heroes are remembered only for how they died. In fact, I can only think of one, a particularly unlucky dude by the name of Actaeon. Now, Actaeon is a little tricky to talk about. Instead of being referenced in only one story or source, he's one of those guys who seems to have been kind of a meme in ancient Greece. He gets referenced all over the place, but a lot of those references are pretty light on the details, more of a get a load of this guy than a let me tell you a tale. The most complete version of his story is recounted in Ovid's Metamorphoses, but it pops up in a lot of earlier literature as a cautionary tale, typically framed as don't disrespect the gods or you'll end up like Actaeon. Funnily enough, those early references don't actually agree on what Actaeon did wrong. In Euripides' play The Bacchae, back in the 400s BCE, Actaeon is cited as a hunter who boasts that he's a better hunter than Artemis, and it's a major no-no to do that in general, so he's devoured by his own hounds. But about 100 years later, the poet Callimachus says in his hymn number 5 that Actaeon accidentally sees Artemis bathing, and since it's a major no-no to behold a deity naked, he's devoured by his own hounds. Then, a little after the turn of the millennium, Pseudo-Apollodorus' Bibliotheca gives us a sprinkling of detail where it specifies that Actaeon is a hunter trained by Chiron who makes the mistake of wooing Semele, girlfriend of Zeus and future mother of Dionysus. This is naturally a bad idea, and at Zeus's command, Actaeon is devoured by his own hounds. Pseudo-Apollodorus does say, however, that this is an unusual telling, and the more popular version of the story is that, like in Callimachus' version, Actaeon's real offense is seeing Artemis bathing, at which point she turns him into a deer, and then he's devoured by his own hounds. The hounds are then confused when they can't find Actaeon and go to Chiron, who figures out the sad story from context clues and carves a statue of Actaeon so the dogs feel better about the whole situation. Now, we're starting to see the faintest hint of a pattern emerging here, but these anecdotal references don't really paint a full picture just yet. For one thing, they don't agree on literally anything other than Actaeon's death. Actaeon is a hunter who pisses off at least one god and is devoured by his own hounds, either explicitly at the god's orders or apparently because that's just a thing that happens. What did he do? Nobody can agree. Which god did he anger? Who's to say? How did he die? Okay, that one we've got down. Now, when discussing Actaeon, most people tend to go with Ovid's version, written in the same general 1st century CE timeframe as Pseudo-Apollodorus' telling, mostly because it is the only version longer than 3 sentences. In Ovid's version, Actaeon is, say it with me now, a hunter. He and his hunter bros have had a long and productive day of hunting, and they're packing it in for the evening and heading home. But unbeknownst to Actaeon, the goddess Artemis happens to have a private grotto nearby where she likes to go and unwind after a long day's hunting with the gals. And unfortunately for Actaeon, he happens to stumble on said private grotto right after Artemis has popped into the water for a nice, refreshing, no-clothes-needed bath. Now, as you may know, Artemis is distinguished in the Olympian pantheon as one of the virgin goddesses whose single status was more than just a personal choice, but also actively sacred. So a dude seeing her naked, accidentally or otherwise, isn't just uncool, it's kinda also sacrilegious. Artemis's nymphs freak out at the intrusion, but Artemis quickly handles the situation by hucking a handful of water at Actaeon and cursing him to silence so he can never tell anyone about this breach of her privacy. The way she does this is by transforming him into a stag, which are famously known for not being able to talk. Actaeon freaks out and bolts into the woods, but makes the rookie mistake of being shaped like a deer at the time, and every hunting dog in the zip code perks up and bolts after him. Actaeon is eventually run down and devoured by his own hounds. What a twist. So, this is one of those cases where the story has a lot of recurring elements, but not every telling has all of those elements, which sometimes indicates that the story underwent an almost organic transformation and evolution over time, starting from a quote-unquote original version before branching and speciating into different versions that each retained individual parts of that original. But it sometimes indicates that the story was always a cluster of other very different stories with only a central point as overlap. To determine which of those things happened here, we need a broader look at the story, one that we can't necessarily find in written works, which we've basically exhausted at this point. Luckily for us, referencing Actaeon was just as popular with artists as it was with poets, and Actaeon shows up in visual media all the time, which can give us a pretty good insight into what elements of the story may have been popular at different times. For instance, earlier versions didn't seem to have Actaeon turning into a deer. In fact, visual representations from the 400s BCE up to the turn of the millennium mostly seem to show Actaeon fully human when he's chased down by his hounds. It's only around the aughts CE that there starts to be an uptick in representations where Actaeon appears to be partially transformed into a deer during the attack. There's a painting of him in Pompeii from the 1st century BCE where he's got little antlers, but before that, he's almost always human. It's not until the Renaissance, a full 1,000 years after Rome, that the artists start leaning on the Actaeon as a deer imagery super heavily, which is also coincidentally when artists started giving us an eyeful of Artemis bathing, evidently missing the entire point of Ovid's telling in the process. Most of the earlier art also only shows Actaeon as a lone figure being killed, with no sign of which god he might have offended to make that happen. A few pieces of the art from that early Roman era feature a woman, probably Artemis, looking pretty cranky but usually, though not always, fully clothed. In some cases, other gods appear to be present, generally disapproving of Actaeon's vibes. In at least one, it looks like Artemis is chasing him down with a spear while other women are bathing nearby. So looking at all this, it seems like the reason we can't find one specific original telling to treat as the real one is because, as is so often the case, there never was one. The only consistent thing about Actaeon was that he pissed off the gods and was devoured by his own hounds. What exactly he did, which god or gods were responsible for his death, whether or not he was deer-shaped at the time, changed. It was most commonly related to Artemis, and more commonly because of the bath, but considering the variety of tellings, it probably only got locked into the cultural zeitgeist as Actaeon copped an eyeful of Artemis's secret maidenhood and she decided not to be cool about it because Ovid's version was the easiest to access and Renaissance art artists were weird like that.
So Actaeon gets chewed up and spit out just before we reach the age of the Argonauts, an era absolutely chaka with heroes of all stripes, including a slightly non-standard example of heroism in the case of Orpheus. Instead of being a monster slayer, Orpheus wanted to change the world with the power of song, and he almost pulled it off, almost being the operative word.
Now, there are two traditional Greek myths about the underworld, and let's face it, you probably already know both of them. But whatever, let's talk about them anyway. Now, the first and better known one is the story of Hades and Persephone, and that one boils down to Hades is lonely and kidnaps Persephone to be his wife. Persephone's mom Demeter objects and refuses to let anything grow until she's returned. Something something pomegranate, something something 6 months of winter. It's a little bit like the Osiris thing, in that Persephone becomes a goddess of the underworld because, by eating the food of the dead, she becomes something of the dead. She didn't actually die, but the concept is the same. Now, I really only like this story in its more modern interpretation, where Persephone had a modicum of agency in the story and actually likes Hades, willingly becoming the queen of the underworld rather than just being kidnapped and getting the munchies. But forget all that, because now that that's done, let's talk about Orpheus and Eurydice. So Orpheus is one of Apollo's kids, and he's a damn good musician, as you would expect of someone related to the god of music. In fact, he's the best musician in the world, and to top off this perfection, he's in love with this really cute girl named Eurydice, and they're about to get married. But unfortunately, shenanigans happen, and Eurydice ends up getting bitten by a snake and dying. So Orpheus is totally heartbroken and starts playing his little heart out, which has the result of bumming everyone else out too. So eventually Apollo's like, I can't take it anymore! These proxy fields are terrible! Son, I order you to go visit your dead girlfriend. Get some damn closure before you make all the rest of us suicidal. So Orpheus meanders sorrowfully down to the underworld and serenades Hades and Persephone with his lyre. And of course, his music is so beautiful that they're immediately moved to help him. Hades agrees to return Eurydice to life, but while Orpheus is leading her out of the underworld, he absolutely cannot look at her until they get to the surface. Otherwise, she'll have to go back, this time for good. It's kind of like the Izanami thing, actually. So Orpheus starts leading Eurydice out of the underworld, but he can't hear her footsteps and starts thinking that maybe Hades tricked him. So, like an idiot, he turns around and sees that, yep, guess what? His beloved Eurydice was behind him all along, and yep, he has officially ruined everything. So Orpheus is heartbroken again, and somehow ends up dead. But don't worry, the muses decide to hang on to his severed head so that he'll be able to sing forever. That's more f***ed up than I remember.
Little fun fact here, while Orpheus's parentage fluctuates a little between different versions, the idea that he is the son of Apollo is a much less well-known version than the one where he's the son of the muse Calliope. I'm not sure why I went with this version instead of the more popular one. Maybe I was divinely inspired, maybe I'm just built different. And speaking of built different, this is also the era that gave us Atalanta, ancient Greece's most well-known and arguably only heroine. As a rule, Greek myths are about as far from egalitarian as you can get, but Atalanta's a breath of fresh air for the ass-kicking ladies in the audience hungry for a rare dose of rep.
Man, it was rough being a girl in ancient Greece. Your life basically had two possible trajectories: marry someone and hope that doesn't go too wrong, or get knocked up by Zeus and be hunted by Hera for the rest of your natural life. Fun times for everybody. But in the great testosterone-laden courts of the ancient Greek heroes, one stands out from the rest as a unique example of a defied cliché, an ancient example of a gloriously modern trope, the token girl. Atalanta. Her name is Atalanta, and yes, to my knowledge, she is the only classical Greek hero who manages to kick ass and have two X chromosomes at the same time. Now, Atalanta's life gets off to a rough start when she's born in Arcadia to a king and queen who really wanted a son. Rather than do that thing where they raise her as a boy or something, the king takes the high road and abandons her on a mountaintop to starve. Stay classy, Arcadian king. So baby Atalanta would be dead 15 times over if it weren't for the timely arrival of a mother bear, which, by the way, is a symbol of Artemis, goddess of badass women and virginity, who takes the baby girl in and raises her as one of her own cubs. So Atalanta is raised by bears, which is like twice as rad as being raised by gorillas, but all good things must come to an end, and Atalanta is discovered by a troop of hunters, who take her back to civilization and raise her as their own. So the hunters teach Atalanta about all the good things civilization has to offer, like languages, and clothes, and sharp objects, and Atalanta grows up to be an all-around badass and an expert huntress. Somewhere along the line, she beats King Peleus in a wrestling match, also known as Achilles' dad, and casually shoots a couple centaurs who wanted to do unsavory things in her general direction. In some versions of her story, she also sails with Jason on the Argo while he goes off to do cool Argonaut things, but in other versions he doesn't let her on board because of the problems having a gorgeous lady on a long sea voyage could cause. So while that's happening, in the nearby kingdom of Caledon, the king manages to completely forget about the goddess Artemis when the time comes for the yearly harvest festival, and that royally pisses her off. So she makes a giant murderous boar and sends it to attack Caledon, where the boar tears through everything and generally makes a ruckus. So the king sends for all the bravest hunters in the area, and along with the standard Greek sausage fest we've come to expect from such a casting call, who should arrive but Atalanta? So the king's like, hey there, miss. My daughters are out back playing in the garden if you want to do something a little more your speed. And Atalanta's like, I'm sorry, I must have misheard you. I was told there was murdering to be done around here, not arts and crafts. And the big scary dude hunters are like, oh hell no, I'm not going on a boar hunt with any girls. But one of the less dickish hunters, the handsome Caledonian prince named Meleager, is all like, oh, I'm sorry, it sounds to me like you're afraid she'll outclass you. No, that's fine. I guess we'll go save the kingdom by ourselves if you're all too scared. So the hunters finally agree to go hunt the boar, and after a lot of cartoonish misadventures involving a lot of hunters getting murdered by the boar, Atalanta stabs it in the back, and Meleager gets a solid hit into the thing's chest. So the hunters are like, "Ah, sick, Meleager, you totally killed it!" Meleager's like, no, come on, guys, Atalanta here got the first strike, she should get the prize. So he gives her the boar's skin as a prize, but Meleager's uncles, who'd been hunting with them, are the biggest dicks of all, and they start pushing Atalanta around, trying to bully her into leaving so they can take all the credit. Meleager tells him to stop, the whole thing escalates into a legit sword fight, and somehow the uncles end up dead. Okay, this part calls for a little bit of backstory. See, Meleager's got a weird little thing about his lifespan. It's directly linked to a piece of firewood. When the wood burns up, he dies. So one of the hunters runs back to the kingdom and tells Meleager's mother, the queen, that Meleager killed her brothers, and the queen flies into a rage and pitches the wood into the fireplace. So Meleager spontaneously drops dead, which I imagine is rather disconcerting to the rest of the hunters, but as much of a bummer as that is, Atalanta has now made a name for herself as the huntress who killed the Caledonian boar. Now, we all know what happens to gorgeous women who get famous. Dudes start flocking from around the world to marry them. Atalanta's royally sick of these suitors all trying to win her favor, and because the word no meant precisely nothing in ancient Greece, they're aggressively persistent, and short of actually murdering them, there's not much Atalanta can do to make them leave her alone. So Atalanta proposes a challenge to her eager suitors. All they have to do is beat her in a foot race, and she'll marry them. But there's one condition: if they lose to her, she'll straight up murder them. That's enough to make around half of them back off, but the remaining suitors race her one at a time, and all lose and then die, and somehow this keeps attracting more suitors. So one day, a young man named Hippomenes comes to town to race for Atalanta's hand in marriage. Now, Hippomenes is nice and handsome and smart and kind of a dork, and even Atalanta doesn't want to see him dead, so she tries to dissuade him from racing her. But Hippomenes is dead set on winning her hand in marriage, and he's actually prepared for the situation. No, not by training. You think any amount of training is gonna let you outrun a woman raised by bears? No, see, he went and talked to Aphrodite, and Aphrodite thought they'd make a super cute couple, so she agreed to help him out. So they start racing, and Atalanta immediately nearly catches up to him because, among other things, Hippomenes is not a great runner. But just as she's about to overtake him, Hippomenes drops a golden apple on the ground. Atalanta loves shiny things, so she stops to grab it, and Hippomenes gets a somewhat respectable lead going, which is immediately closed as Atalanta unsurprisingly catches up immediately. So Hippomenes drops a second golden apple, even bigger and shinier than the first one, and Atalanta again runs off to get it. Again, Hippomenes gets a solid lead, and again Atalanta catches up, and Hippomenes throws his third and final golden apple, and Atalanta accidentally takes too long to go and get it. So Atalanta lets Hippomenes win, and the two get married and presumably live out the rest of their days being totally adorable.
But this age of heroes wasn't all fun and games. It also saw the founding of Athens by its legendary hero Theseus, monster slayer and all-around dumbass. Theseus first makes a name for himself by cleaning up a mess from Cadmus's family tree. King Minos of Crete is Cadmus's nephew, and Minos' basement has that unfortunate Minotaur problem just begging for a strapping young protagonist type to come in and prove himself about it. Let's hope it goes well.
Pro tip, character designers: if you're struggling to come up with a monster design, try just mashing random animals together. Satisfaction guaranteed, works every time. Ancient Greece was certainly a big fan of the concept, as basically every monster in the mythos is either regular person or animal with a non-standard number of limbs, heads, or eyes, or two or more animals mashed together. It's usually not even explained why they're like that. Why is the offspring of Poseidon and Medusa a horse with wings? Who knows? Why do Typhon and Echidna, two mostly humanoid, somewhat snaky monsters, produce several multi-headed dogs and one perfect combo of goat, snake, and lioness? Primordial genetics is funky like that. And geez, the Minotaur? What unholy union could have made a half-bull, half-dude? Well, actually, that one is pretty straightforward, but you're not gonna like it. Now, contextually, the Minotaur is a kind of mysterious figure because the Minoan civilization he's derived from is pretty unknown in a lot of ways. It was a powerful Bronze Age civilization that flourished on the island of Crete from 3000 BCE to about 1100 BCE, and it's not 100% clear what caused it to fall apart, but it super fell apart, so hard we didn't even know it existed until 1900. We have tons of their relics and architecture and stuff, and also a lot of their writing, but unfortunately we can't understand any of it. Yep, it's all in linear A and mysterious hieroglyphs, and we can't read any of them. So we kind of have no idea what they were up to. But because of their extensive trade network, plenty of civilizations we can understand were influenced by them, and we have lots of myths and stories and maybe even some gods that seem to have been originally derived from the largely unknown Minoan religion. Now, basically everything about that is pure speculation, but if there's one thing we can say with confidence, it's that bulls show up a lot. Not minotaurs, though. While bull-headed humans show up in Greek art about Crete, Minoan art itself only ever shows regular bulls. The Minotaur is a specifically Greek story about the ancient Minoans, referencing their widespread bull symbolism by peppering in bulls and bull accessories at regular intervals. It also frames the mythologized Minoan civilization in a generally antagonistic role, possibly because of all the forced oceanic trade, also known as piracy. So basically, it's biased, filtered, and offset from the source by several centuries, but we have nothing else to go on because we can't read their language. Let this be a PSA. Don't let languages die, kids. You're gonna really annoy scholars in like 3,000 years. So anyway, the tale of the Minotaur begins with King Minos of Crete, the son of Zeus and Europa. So we're already off to a roaring start start in the functional relationships department. In order to prove that he's a bad enough dude to rule Crete instead of his brothers Rhadamanthus or Sarpedon, Minos calls in a favor from Poseidon, who sends him a beautiful snow-white bull, with the understanding that Minos is going to sacrifice the bull to him afterwards as thanks. Everyone is super impressed with this stake in the making, and Minos becomes king, but he's just so impressed with this bull that he refuses to sacrifice it, and swaps it out for a way lamer, super less hot bull. Poseidon is enraged by this slight, so he slips Aphrodite a 20 to get her to make Minos' wife Pasiphae fall in love with the bull. What could go wrong? But unlike Pasiphae, the Cretan bull has very high standards. First of all, being a quadruped is a must. Second of all, must also be a cow. Fortunately, from a certain point of view, acclaimed architect, inventor, and future part-time aeronaut Daedalus happens to be on Crete at the time, so Pasiphae commissions him to make her a hollow wooden cow suit for recreational purposes. Daedalus, consummate professional that he is, takes the commission with zero outward judging, and I'm just gonna skip over this part because, come on, we get it. Oh hey, where'd that thing come from? So the Minotaur, as the child abomination of a truly beastly relationship, doesn't really have a place in the natural order of things, which unfortunately means he can't really eat anything besides people. Tragic. Rather than, I don't know, killing him or letting him starve or something, Minos consults the oracle at Delphi, who tells him to build that sucker a lavish basement apartment and then throw away the key. Daedalus scores another commission when Minos asks him to build an absolutely massive labyrinth for the Minotaur. Then, to make sure nobody learns how the labyrinth works, Minos locks Daedalus up in a tower with Icarus, 5 tons of supplies, and every tool ever made. That ought to hold him, but that's a story for, 4 years ago, apparently. So anyway, with the Minotaur functionally imprisoned in a really big, impossibly complicated maze, that fixes the potential rampage problem, but still leaves the whole food issue kind of up in the air. But what's the point in being king if you can't be kind of a dick about it? The exact justifications vary from telling to telling, but long story short, Minos demands a human sacrifice of 14 young Athenians every few years to keep the Minotaur fed. This goes smoothly for the first couple sacrifices, but on the third go-round, this whole Minotaur human sacrifice situation draws the attention of a spunky young hero aiming to prove himself. Specifically Theseus, Athens' founder hero and official best boy, which really reflects more poorly on Athens than anything else. Anywho, Theseus brings a big cool boat and plenty of gumption, but not much in the way of a plan. So it's lucky for him that Minos' daughter Ariadne takes one look at this new cute boy and goes full head over heels for him, possibly because she doesn't get out much. Now, Ariadne is very familiar with the labyrinth. In fact, in one early citation of the story mentioned in the Iliad, it suggested the original version of Daedalus' labyrinth was built specifically for Ariadne as a dancing path with no Minotaur involved. Mythologically, Ariadne and the labyrinth go way back, maybe even farther back than the Minotaur, and some people theorize Ariadne is actually originally some kind of Cretan goddess known as the Mistress of the Labyrinth, which is dope as all hell, but not what we're here for. Ariadne helps Theseus out by giving him a ball of thread, called a clue, that'll let him retrace his path out of the labyrinth, and Theseus makes his way down with her guidance, eventually finding the Minotaur and engaging it in totally rad combat until he manages to decapitate it. You're welcome, Minos. And so ends the tale of the Minotaur. Surprisingly, well, I think it's surprising anyway, Minos doesn't seem too happy to have his monster problem fixed, and Theseus and Ariadne book it out of Crete along with the other Athenians. But for whatever reason, later retconned as divine intervention, but originally just kind of a huge dick move, Theseus totally ditches Ariadne and leaves her alone on the shores of Naxos while she sleeps. Fortunately, when she wakes up, her grief and betrayal is mitigated somewhat by the fact that Dionysus himself shows up to help her out and also maybe propose or something because he thinks she's really cute. And they end up getting married and living very happy immortal lives together up on Olympus. While in contrast, Theseus' love life goes not well. What with all the kidnapping and personally pissing off Hades and such. Yeesh, javelin dodged. Moral of the story? Probably, keep your promises, be true to your responsibilities, and, oh yeah, stop boning animals! Jeez, guys.
Theseus is a good case study in the fact that having a really solid monster-slaying opportunity teed up is not enough to make a hero, especially not a good one. And Theseus could take home the gold in the self-inflicted problems Olympics. He was especially bad for his immediate family, including his father, who he absent-mindedly got killed by forgetting to swap out his bad news I totally died signal for his great news I totally didn't one, and he was also directly responsible for the death of his son Hippolytus. So let's get into that real quick.
To say that Artemis and Aphrodite don't always get along would be something of an understatement, and it's hardly surprising from an analytical standpoint. They're symbolically antithetical to each other, one representing love, sex, and beauty, the other virginity and badassitude. But beyond their natural rivalry with each other, Aphrodite has specifically never been too keen on Artemis's hunters, mostly because of the whole no relationships thing. It's one thing for Artemis to be naturally contradictory to Aphrodite, but it's another thing entirely for mortals to choose Artemis over Aphrodite. And considering that this is a goddess who took the mere existence of a pretty girl personally, Aphrodite has an unsurprising tendency to be very petty when it comes to the
the hunters of Artemis. Like Hippolytus, for instance. Never heard of him? That's not too surprising. He's not a big-name hero like his father Theseus, or just a big name like his mother Hippolyta. Now, Hippolytus has devoted himself to Artemis, choosing a life of hunting and no girlfriend over no hunting and yes girlfriend. This offends Aphrodite on principle, who reacts with about as much restraint as we've come to expect from her, and she resolves to ruin his life for having the audacity to not be into girls. So Aphrodite's flawless plan progresses thusly. First, she uses her goddess magic to make Hippolytus' stepmom Phaedra fall in love with him. This makes Phaedra totally lovesick, and she tries to get Hippolytus to sleep with her, which he soundly refuses to do, because and also well, Phaedra doesn't take this very well, so she goes to Theseus and tells him that Hippolytus, forced himself on her. In some versions, she actually kills herself first, and her suicide note carries the accusation instead. Either way, Theseus is outraged and calls in a favor from his father Poseidon to have Hippolytus killed. Poseidon sends a sea monster to spook Hippolytus' horses, who subsequently drag him to his death. Now, that sucks, obviously, but the story doesn't actually end here. See, Hippolytus was lucky enough to get his very own historical cult, and as far as the cult's personal headcanon was concerned, no way in hell was Artemis letting one of her hunters die for something so stupid. So Artemis calls in a favor from Asclepius, the doctor so good he could resurrect the dead, and makes him resurrect the dead, bringing Hippolytus back to life. Hooray! Now in this version, he also moves to Latium and becomes a Roman god Virbius, because syncretism, and I think one line in the Iliad makes it seem like he actually married someone, which kinda feels like it subverts the whole premise of the story, really.
We'll be gratified to know that Theseus' cavalcade of fuckery didn't just wreck the people close to him. Sometimes the consequences managed to get him directly. One of his most embarrassing debacles was a real pain in the ass.
Hades has really gotten a bad rep over the years. People hear King of the Underworld and suddenly all they can see is Satan. The thing is, mythological Hades never did anything to deserve his bad rep. Sure, he kidnapped Persephone, but this was a time when kidnapping your future wife wasn't as frowned upon as it is today, and by all accounts their relationship was remarkably functional. He asked Zeus to stop Asclepius from resurrecting the dead, but it's not his fault that Zeus interpreted that as set the guy on fire. He helped Orpheus reunite with his dead wife, and hey, it's not his fault that the kid did the one thing he warned him not to do. By all accounts, Hades is a really nice guy who loves his wife, keeps his promises, and does his job. Also, there's evidence that Kerberos means spotted, so this enormous dork also named his three-headed hellhound Spot. You gotta love this guy. In his entire run as Lord of the Underworld, Hades has only messed up 2 people, and believe me, they deserve it. These are their stories. So you've probably all heard of Theseus, famous for killing the Minotaur and abandoning his wife on a desert island, but you probably haven't heard of his bro Pirithous because he's pretty much only known for this. So Pirithous and Theseus are egotistical as only Greek heroes can be, and decide that they both deserve to marry a daughter of Zeus. Theseus settles on Helen of Troy, who is only 12 at this point, and they run off and kidnap her. Now of course it wouldn't be appropriate for Theseus to get with a 12-year-old, so the flawless plan is to keep her until she reaches legal banging age. I cannot believe how much crap Helen gets put through. Can you believe people still blame her for the Trojan War? Anyway, as disgusting as that was, Pirithous has an even better idea. He wants to marry Persephone. Did I say better? I meant mind-bogglingly stupid. But amazingly, Theseus goes along with this plan. Take notes, everybody. Friends don't let friends kidnap goddesses. So the bros scoot down into the underworld, where they encounter a slightly livid Hades, who, like any good host, offers them seats at his dinner table. They cheerfully sit down, you know, may as well get to know your future husband-in-law before kidnapping and marrying his wife, whereupon snakes are up from the ground and fuse them to their chairs. Hades sicks the Furies on them and calls it a night. Theseus, you are supposed to be smarter than this! Let that be a lesson, folks. Don't try and kidnap the queen of the underworld when her mild-mannered husband is within earshot. Or maybe, just to be safe, don't mess with Hades. Period.
See, I'd go with the snakes too, but I wouldn't use them as literally as that.
But Theseus is lucky that this is also the era of Heracles, the great-grandson of Perseus, and a man so good at killing monsters he literally made it his career. Famous for his overwhelming rage, his 12 labors, and his mondo big boy muscles, Heracles was good at setting the bar high.
Well, what's the point of me doing this one? Everyone already knows Hercules. He's basically ancient Greek Superman with a healthy dose of modern sports stardom, right? Did 12 cool things, got the girl, called it a day. Couldn't be simpler.
Well, no. Hercules is a lot of things, but simple is not one of them. First of all, Hercules is the Roman hero. Heracles is the original Greek version, named for the glory of Hera and an ineffectual attempt to keep her from trying to murder him. Unsurprisingly, they are pretty distinct. Second of all, remember this word?
I've talked a bit how hubris was the most common character flaw for Greek heroes. They'd
Think too highly of themselves, try to be gods, and end up getting smacked down for their sins.
So far, we've only seen one major subversion of this, which was Perseus, who basically didn't have any flaws. But Heracles is also a subversion because his biggest flaw is wrath.
How unexpectedly modern, right? Well, Heracles begins his life, as so many heroes do, with Zeus spotting a fine-looking lady, this one by the name of Alcmene. Zeus does his thing and shapeshifts into her husband, Amphitryon, and gets her pregnant. The very same night, her actual husband scoots on by and does the same thing. That's right, today's first plot twist is that Heracles had a twin. So Hera is livid, as she always is when Zeus pulls this kind of nonsense, but this time she's extra miffed and starts trying to take as many petty revenges on the baby as she can possibly think of. Priority 1 is screwing Heracles out of his birthright. So the night Heracles and his twin are slated to be born, Hera convinces Zeus to make the next descendant of Perseus to be born the king. Now Alcmene is one of Perseus' descendants, meaning Heracles is slated to be the next descendant of Perseus, so Zeus is totally okay with the idea, whereupon Hera zips down and kidnaps Alethea, the goddess of childbirth, to keep Heracles and his brother right where they are until the day is done. Then she causes Heracles' cousin Eurystheus to be born prematurely, so he gets to be the king instead. Fortunately, Alcmene gets to give birth eventually because one of her servants tricks Alethea into bailing, whereupon Hera turns the servant into a weasel as revenge. The family still keeps her around though, which is nice. Anyway, Alcmene is acutely aware of the fact that the baby is already a problem for her and will probably only cause more problems later on, so she kicks him out, whereupon Athena scoops him up and ferries him over to Hera, telling her that someone left this poor baby just lying around, whereupon Hera pities the little guy and nurses him a bit. Unfortunately, Heracles is a toothy baby and boob noms a little too hard. Hera chucks him because ow, but the damage is done, because her magic milk has given him superpowers, making him crazy strong. Athena takes the little guy back to his parents and they raise him pretty uneventfully, except for that one time with the snakes. So prior to the 12 tasks thing, Heracles' story is a little muddled, which is pretty common for culture heroes. They tend to accumulate stories over time. The main highlight is one time teenage Heracles gets pissy because he's having trouble learning to play the lyre and ends up killing his teacher as a result. Then a while later, he ends up in Thebes, where he courts and marries Megara, the daughter of King Creon. They have 2 beautiful children, whereupon Hera drives Heracles crazy and he kills all 3 of them. He gets his brain back, is immediately stricken with grief, and goes to consult the oracle about what he should do to atone. The oracle, guided by Hera, tells him he needs to atone for his crimes by serving his cousin, King Eurystheus, for 10 years and doing whatever he tells him to. This is all part of her cunning plan to accidentally make Heracles the most famous and revered Greek hero ever, because nobody ever just kills anybody in these stories. So this leads to the famous 12 labors, or rather 10 plus a couple extra. Initially, Eurystheus gives him 10 labors, but 2 of them get discounted for shenanigans. Number 1 is to kill the Nemean lion, known for being immune to all mortal weapons and having the general disposition of a chainsaw strapped to a ceiling fan. Heracles ends up strangling it and skinning it with one of its own claws. Mission number 2 is killing the Lernaean Hydra, for which Heracles conscripts his half-nephew and sometimes lover, Iolaus, for moral support. That happened a lot in ancient Greece, don't question it. Anyway, after learning that cutting off the heads just causes more heads to grow back, Iolaus suggests using fire to burn the neck stumps, which works really well. Before they leave, Heracles takes some poisonous Hydra blood and coats his arrows with it. Because why not, right? With that out of the way, Heracles returns home, but Eurystheus is all, hey, you got help for that one, dude, doesn't count, and adds another trial for later. So trial number 3 is to capture, alive this time, the Ceryneian hind, a deer sacred to Artemis. Eurystheus' cunning plan here is to have Heracles offend Artemis and get her to kill him, but as soon as Heracles explains what's up with his trials and such, Artemis is like, yeah dude, go for it, just bring her back when you're done. So Heracles brings the hind to Eurystheus, but Eurystheus is too slow to actually catch it, and it zorps back to Artemis no problem. Mission accomplished. Mission 4 is to capture the Arithmanian boar, but Heracles gets distracted along the way and parties it up with a centaur friend for a while instead. Unfortunately, centaurs apparently don't know that Greek wine needs to be watered down before it's drinkable, so they all get super drunk and then start trying to pick fights. Heracles drives him off with his poisoned arrows, but his centaur buddy accidentally drops one on his foot and dies. Well, that was kind of pointless. Anyway, after that fiasco, Heracles visits the immortal centaur Chiron for advice, who tells him that the boar is impossible to stop while charging, so he needs to drive him into the snow to immobilize him and then carry him off. So Heracles does, and brings the boar back to Eurystheus, who immediately freaks out and makes him release it back into the wild. Mission number 5 is to clean the stables of King Augeas, which are filthy. So Heracles first gets the guy to promise him 10% of his prize cattle if he manages to pull it off, then diverts 2 rivers through the stables and cleans them out super efficiently, surprisingly not demolishing the building in the process. But Augeas is a sore loser and refuses to pay up, so Heracles and Augeas' son Phileus take him to court, whereupon he sidesteps all that legal nonsense by banishing them both, because he is the king. And then Eurystheus refuses to credit the trial because Heracles did it for pay, even though he didn't get paid. Heracles gets pretty pissed and kicks Augeas out of the kingdom and makes his son Phileus the king, then takes his cows and goes home. Mission number 6 is to drive out the Stymphalian birds from the swamp they live in, which he does with a little divine help. Athena has Hephaestus make him a special rattle to frighten the birds into the air, whereupon Heracles is free to shoot them down. Trial 7 is to capture the Cretan bull, mostly known for being the father of the Minotaur. Ew. So Heracles wanders into Crete and asks Minos if he can take the bull, which Minos is fine with since that stupid bull has done nothing but wreck stuff ever since he got there. So Heracles picks him up and brings him back, whereupon the bull breaks loose and wanders around Marathon for a while before dropping out of the story completely. Trial 8 involves capturing the mares of Diomedes, which is complicated by the fact that the mares mostly eat people and they're very hard to control. Heracles ends up isolating them on an island he dug out for just that purpose, then kills Diomedes and feeds him to the horses to calm them down. This chills them out enough that it's easy for him to bring them back. Trial number 9 is to retrieve the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. Fortunately, Heracles being Heracles, this isn't too hard, as Hippolyta takes one look at him and quite willingly drops her clothes. However, Hera decides this was too easy, and spreads a rumor among the Amazons that Heracles intends to kidnap their queen. They dogpile on him, and in the chaos, Heracles kills Hippolyta for some reason and bails with the girdle. Mission 10 is to steal the cattle of Geryon. Unfortunately, he lives on the other side of a stupid hot desert, and Heracles gets so grumpy and overheated that he fires an arrow at the sun. Fortunately, Helios finds this charming rather than intimidating, and loans Heracles his sun chariot to get him there faster. So Heracles touches down on Erythia, whereupon he's attacked by Orthus, the two-headed dog, who he kills. Then Evrytion, the cattle herd, hears the commotion and comes by to help, and gets killed too. Finally, Geryon comes out in full battle armor and is, you guessed it, killed. So Heracles scoots back with the cattle after taking an extra year to round them all up because Hera thought it'd be funny to send a gadfly to spook him. Eurystheus then sacrifices the cattle to Hera, which does nothing to soothe her nerves. Trial number 11 is to retrieve apples from the Garden of the Hesperides, which is complicated somewhat by the fact that the location of the garden is a secret. So Heracles wrestles the location out of Nereus, the old man of the sea, and heads off. On the way, he runs into this dude Antaeus, who's immortal, but only so long as he's touching the earth. He challenges Heracles to a wrestling match, and when Heracles realizes he can't beat him by pinning him, he just picks him up and crushes him. Anyway, so Heracles reaches the Garden of the Hesperides, but he can't get the apples because the tree is guarded by this big dragony thing named Ladon. Fortunately, nearby is the Titan Atlas, busily holding up the sky. So Heracles is like, hey buddy, hey! Yeah, want to do me a solid and grab me some apples? And Atlas is like, sure dude, but you'll need to carry this. Sky ain't gonna hold itself up, you know? So Heracles tags in and holds up the sky while Atlas scoots over to the tree and picks some apples. So Heracles is like, yo, thanks man. Hey, can you tag back in? And Atlas is like, actually, how about you just tell me where to take these and I deliver your apples for you? So Heracles is like, oh man, that just sounds great, but my cape's getting really uncomfortable. Could you tag in for a second so I can adjust it and then we'll swap back out? And Atlas is like, what could go wrong? And takes back the sky, at which point Heracles obviously bails. For his 12th and final labor, Eurystheus straight up tells Heracles to go to hell and kidnap Cerberus. So Heracles traipses down to Hades, whereupon he bumps into Theseus and Pirithous, still fused to their chairs. They ask him for help, so Heracles frees Theseus, but when he tries for Pirithous, there's a huge earthquake, which he takes as a sign that he should probably leave him there. So Heracles heads deeper into the underworld and encounters Cerberus, along with Hades, who asks him what exactly he thinks he's doing. So Heracles tells him he's here to kidnap his dog, and Hades tells him okay, but he can't use any weapons to do it, which Heracles is fine with because, again, wrestling. So he bear hugs one of Cerberus' heads until he gives in, and I guess Hades objects or something because most tellings of the story involve Heracles shooting him for some reason. So Heracles drags Cerberus out to Eurystheus, who is unsurprisingly so terrified that he demands Heracles return him immediately. So Heracles carries Cerberus back to Hades and goes on his merry way, finally free of his service to Eurystheus. Now Heracles' story doesn't end with his labors. He has all kind of hijinks, frankly too many to list here. A lot of those hijinks were romantic. He was married 4 times, his third wife being the one to kill him, and one noteworthy thing is that Heracles, as a symbol of pure masculinity for Greece, had a lot of dude lovers too, because what's manlier than 2 men? Apparently in Plutarch's time, it was customary for male couples to worship at the tomb of Iolaus, who was widely considered to be Heracles' primary boyfriend, which is kinda sweet. But anyway, I kinda glossed over the fact that he dies somewhere along the line, so let's talk about that. Heracles is on marriage number 3, and his wife is this lady Deianira. For those of you who know Greek, her name is a spoiler, as it translates to husband destroyer. So one day, this centaur Nessus decides to kidnap her, which Heracles obviously objects to. He shoots the centaur with one of his old Hydra blood arrows, and the poisoned centaur tells Deianira that his blood can totally make a potion to keep her husband faithful should she ever need such a thing. He persuades her to bottle some of his blood and then dies. This becomes relevant several years later, when Heracles falls in love with this other lady, Iole. Deianira remembers the love potion thing, takes some of the blood, and smears it on the inside of one of Heracles' tunics, whereupon, because it's full of Hydra venom and very, very poisonous, the blood melts into Heracles' body and seriously f***s him up. He's too tough for it to kill him, but it really hurts, so he kinda decides to die anyway. Heracles throws himself into a funeral pyre and burns away his mortal half, becoming a pure god and ascending to Olympus in the process, whereupon he marries Hebe, the goddess of youth. Philoctetes, the guy who lit the pyre, gets gifted Heracles' poison arrows and later uses them to kill Paris in the Trojan War, so I guess some good came of all this.
Heracles may have won the heroism lottery by straight up ascending to godhood in the end, but while he was still kicking around as a mortal, he wasn't alone in his adventures. In fact, this was the generation of the Argonauts, the crack team of big-name heroes assembled by Jason to help him out on his quest for the Golden Fleece, including Heracles, Orpheus, Atalanta and her buddy Meleager, Theseus and Pirithous, and plenty more special guest stars. And on the subject of Jason,
I don't think it's exactly controversial to suggest that Greek mythology is a bit lacking in the nuanced female characters department. The goddesses have their fair share of personality, and you do get the occasional anomalous powerhouse like Atalanta and Kirke, but for the most part, the ladies of Greek mythology are fairly one note. Queens who mother heroes, princesses who fall in love with heroes, random targets of divine retribution, Zeus's girlfriend of the week, not a whole lot of variety, and certainly not much in the depth department. Usually the most interesting thing about these women is either what hero they boinked or how they died. Nice to know modern media is really sticking to its roots on that one. But there's one crowning exception to the rule, and that is Medea. Granddaughter of Helios, princess of Colchis, powerful sorceress, and somewhere in the gray area between girl boss and supervillain, Medea is anything but boring. She shows up off and on through later Greek mythology, but her story is mostly codified in two texts. First, the Argonautica, a Greek epic poem from the 200s BCE, written by Apollonius Rhodes and based off the well-known Hellenistic mythology of the time. And second, Medea, a tragic play written earlier by Euripides around 431 BCE. The first half of her life is an epic, the second half is a tragedy. I think we can safely assume this story is gonna have some twists in it. Now, this video is not about the Argonautica, it's about Medea, so we're gonna play a little fast and loose with this summary until our leading lady hits the stage. Got it? Good. Now, the events of the Argonautica take place a few decades before the Trojan War. This is the previous generation of heroes before the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the Argonautica is mostly about Jason, Prince of Thessaly, whose father Aeson was overthrown by his treacherous half-brother Peleus, who kills all of Aeson's descendants except for Jason, who's smuggled out to be raised by the centaur Chiron. Many years later, Jason returns to Thessaly to claim his rightful throne and runs into an old lady who needs help getting across a river. Jason carries her across, losing a sandal in the process, but gaining something very valuable in return, the favor of Hera, who it turns out was the old woman all along. From this point on, Hera regularly intervenes with subtle acts of divine intervention to help her boy out. Jason arrives at the palace and demands Peleus gives him his rightful throne, but Peleus hits him with the classic "hey kid, you like proving yourself" maneuver and sends Jason on a quest to retrieve the Golden Fleece, a textbook MacGuffin that could have been literally anything. Jason assembles a crack team of heroes called the Argonauts, and they set sail on the Argo for Colchis, where the Golden Fleece is stowed. The exact crew kinda depends on who you ask. Every version of the story has a different set of heroes on board. Sometimes Atalanta's around, sometimes Jason decreed the Argo a strictly no girls allowed zone, sometimes Theseus and Pirithous are there, sometimes they're already stuck in Hades for the crime of being absolute morons. Heracles is usually on board, but amusingly, he gets totally ditched early on, and they keep having near misses for the rest of the book without ever meeting back up again. The cast list doesn't really matter. This is basically just an excuse to let an ensemble cast of heroes deal with a bunch of weird island shit for a while. So after a lot of filler, they eventually reach the kingdom of Colchis, where the Golden Fleece is held. But unfortunately, Colchis is ruled by a different, unrelated evil king named Aeetes, who also hits Jason with the patented "hey kid, you like proving yourself" gambit, and sets him a series of tasks to do before he gets the fleece. First, he'll have to yoke a field full of deadly, fire-breathing oxen, and then use them to plow the field, then he'll need to sow the field with dragon's teeth, and finally defeat an army of warriors. Jason's not too optimistic about his prospects, so he and the Argonauts head off to discuss their options. But fortunately for Jason, Aeetes has a sexy sorceress daughter named Medea, and with a little nudging from Hera, Eros hits her with the arrow of love. Suddenly head over heels for this handsome stranger, Medea finds herself utterly tormented by this new conflict of interests. She desperately wants to help Jason out, but she hates the thought of betraying her father, and she's pretty scared of what he might do to her if he finds out she's been involved. Hera sends her dreams where Jason came to her kingdom not for the Golden Fleece, but for her hand in marriage. But when she chooses him over her family and accomplishes his impossible tasks for him, her family is enraged. She wakes up, conflicted almost to the point of suicide, but while she's absolutely terrified of dying in disgrace, known to the world only as a foolish woman who gave up everything for a stranger, she eventually steals her resolve and decides to help Jason out, because love. She arranges for a covert meeting at the Temple of Hecate, where she serves as a priestess, tricking her handmaidens into thinking she's only pretending to like Jason so she can sabotage his success with evil magic. When Jason arrives, they awkwardly blush for a hot minute before Jason explains that he knows she's his only hope of success, and if she helps him, he'll make sure she's famous throughout Greece for her heroism. He compares her to Ariadne helping Theseus through the Minotaur's maze, and smitten by his praise, Medea gives him a potion called the Charm of Prometheus that'll make him invulnerable. She also explains how to handle the other challenges. Anyway, the day arrives, and Jason heads to the field, where, currently invulnerable thanks to Medea's potion, he easily yokes the fire-breathing bulls and sows the field with dragon's teeth. After a quick snack break, he returns to find an army of warriors have sprouted from the dragon's teeth, and recalling Medea's advice, he chucks a rock at them, and all the warriors get confused and pissed off, thinking one of them did it, and then they all kill each other. With the tasks completed, Jason's riding pretty high, and King Aeetes is baffled that Jason managed to pull it off. That night, Hera sends Medea nightmares to warn her that Aeetes has figured out her involvement, and Medea wakes up and runs into the night, arriving at the Argo and telling them they gotta get out of there right this minute and also please take her with them. Jason promises to do her one better and marry her the minute they get back to Greece. They obviously need to grab the Golden Fleece first, so Medea charms the dragon guarding it to sleep while Jason retrieves the fleece. Then they get the heck out of Dodge. The Colchians obviously give chase, with one of the fleets led by Medea's brother Absyrtus, and Jason and Medea come up with a cunning plan to deal with him. It's murder. The plan is murder. They lure him into a trap and Jason dismembers him. Now Zeus gets pretty pissed about this whole family murder thing, so he curses the voyage to get all turned around and confused by the wind. So the journey home ends up taking a lot longer than expected, although that's partially resolved when they end up blowing ashore on Kirke's island and she magically cleanses Medea and Jason of the guilt for the murder. Didn't know she could do that. useful. A few more filler arcs happen while they sail home, and Jason and Medea end up getting properly married on an island, so Medea won't be sent back to Colchis by the king of the island, who's a pretty nice guy and won't break up a properly married couple. Jason and Medea are married in a sacred cave on the cliffside and take a nice little wedding night nap on top of the Golden Fleece, which I will admit was not a detail I was expecting to read in this ancient Greek epic. Yeah, Peleus, I don't know if you're gonna want to touch that. So after a long and complicated voyage home, the lovers finally return to Thessaly. Now that's around where the Argonautica peters out, but the story's not over. The next bit is recounted in a short, now lost play by Euripides called the Pleiades. Now obviously Peleus doesn't want to give up the throne, proving himself be damned. He's also gone ahead and killed all of Jason's relatives just to, be proactive. But don't worry, Medea has a solution. It's murder. The solution is murder. She shows Peleus' daughters a cool spell she knows for rejuvenation by butchering an old ram and throwing the pieces into a boiling pot of herbs, at which point a young and healthy lamb jumps out. The daughters think that's really cool, so they go grab their dad and butcher him, and he's dead. He's just dead. Oops. So that's basically the first half of Medea's story. A young, demure, love-struck woman falls head over heels for a handsome, heroic stranger and gives up everything to save him from an impossible situation, and then he rescues her from her vengeful family and brings her to a better land to marry him and live happily ever after. That is a beautiful, classic, textbook love story plus or minus a couple murders. So why is the play Medea a tragedy? Buckle up, it's actually kind of fascinating. So to start us off, Jason has a bit of a problem. See, what with the whole gruesome death of Peleus and all, Jason is now an accessory to a crime, and he can't really claim the throne of Thessaly, little known downside to solving all your problems with murder. So he and Medea decide to head to Corinth instead. A few years evidently pass and they make a home there, but Jason ends up courting Glauce, princess of Corinth and daughter of King Creon, in the hopes that marrying her will make him royalty and ensure the future of his line, as well as the safety of Medea and their 2 children, because by the way, they have 2 children now. Now this is, what's the word? Adultery, that's right. Jason is married to Medea, both in the eyes of the law and the gods, and now he's trying to marry this Corinthian princess for the perks. Medea is understandably furious and has been completely inconsolable with grief and rage for long enough that King Creon is starting to get worried she might end up doing something drastic, like, just spitballing here, murder. So he decides he should exile her and her children so she can't do any murdering. She successfully pleads with him to give her 1 more day to get her affairs in order before he exiles her, and he agrees, which is unwise because now he's given her 24 hours to get all that murdering out of her system. But Medea isn't stupid. We've already seen how clever she is and how carefully she arranges her exit strategies. We also already know from the Argonautica that her worst fear is being abandoned and suffering the humiliation of sacrificing everything for a stranger who doesn't even care about her. She definitely wants revenge, but she knows she can't just start willy-nilly murdering people. Then she'll still be abandoned and also wanted for murder. While she's pondering this conundrum, Jason shows up to tell her that if she'd just been cool about him ditching her for this new woman, she wouldn't be getting exiled right now. Medea enumerates the many ways she's saved his ass in the past and accuses him of denying his oaths to the gods, which sets up a pretty interesting theme in this story of Medea's actions, no matter how murdery, having the tacit approval of the gods. More on that later. Anyway, Medea points out that exile is almost a death sentence because she's made enemies everywhere by constantly helping out Jason, who has a habit of pissing people off and then requiring magical assistance. And Jason counters that really she got more than she gave in that bargain because, sure, she sacrificed her family and homeland to do his impossible tasks for him and saved his life over and over again. But hey, now she gets to live in Greece, not that icky barbarian place she came from. And also, she's famous now because of all that cool stuff she did for him that he got to take the credit for. Besides, Medea's just some barbarian woman with phenomenal cosmic powers. Jason can't pass up a real princess. His genius plan was to keep Medea as his mistress when he marries the princess so he could get them some sweet royal protection, and then eventually Medea's lame, not royal kids will have some properly royal half-siblings. Isn't that lovely? Unfortunately, Medea getting herself exiled has spoiled his brilliant plan somewhat, but don't worry, he's totally willing to give her some money to make that whole wandering the wasteland with 2 young children thing easier. Oh man, I want to see her kill him so bad. So Jason leaves, and when Medea heads outside to think, she runs into Aegeus, king of Athens, who greets her like an old friend. Apparently he's in town because he wanted to ask the oracle why his wiener doesn't work, but when he sees Medea looking so down, he asks what's wrong, and she fills him in on Jason being the absolute worst. He's totally sympathetic and offers her sanctuary in Athens, though he does say he can't actually get her there, she'll have to make her own way over. Medea, cautious as ever, tells him she's made quite a lot of enemies, and she needs to know he'll be willing to protect her from, I don't know, retribution or something? He promises, and with her exit strategy firmly in place, Medea gets down to the brass tacks of plotting a murder. So Medea takes a beautiful golden gown and coronet, 2 gifts from Helios, and applies a poison to them so potent that it won't just kill whoever wears them, it'll also kill anyone that person touches. She also ponders killing her kids, reasoning that'll hurt Jason pretty bad, although the chorus points out it'll also hurt her a lot more, since Jason is kind of a terrible dad who doesn't really like them that much, but Medea decides it's worth it. I mean, it wouldn't be the first family she's murdered. Anyway, she calls Jason back in and pretends to be all remorseful about their argument, and Jason totally buys it because he knows women tend to get emotional when their husbands leave them for other women. Medea tells him she hates the thought of their poor children sharing her exile, and couldn't he possibly convince Creon to let them stay? Jason's not sure about Creon, but he thinks he can convince Glaucia to do it, what with her being a woman and thus dumb and emotional and stuff. Medea gives the gown and coronet to her kids and tells them to be very convincing and persuade Glaucia to let them stay by giving her these wedding gifts. She sends them off, and evidently they're very persuasive because they come back without the presents. Medea suffers from a brief internal conflict over murdering them, and then a messenger arrives in a panic telling her to get the hell out of Dodge because everyone's dead and they're definitely gonna blame her. He's probably not expecting Medea to respond, "Ooh, spill the tea! Did she suffer? Tell me she suffered." So apparently when the kids showed up, everyone was excited because it meant Medea was maybe getting over her grudge. Everyone except for Glaucia, who refused to even look at them until they showed her the shiny presents. She immediately put them on, stumbled around for a bit, and then caught fire. It's a hell of a poison. So she dies, and Creon cradles her body, at which point he also dies. Whoopsies. The messenger books it, and Medea decides this at least makes the whole child murder thing easier, since killing the entire royal family of Corinth is gonna get them killed anyway. She heads discreetly off stage, and the kids yell about how they are very definitely getting murdered right now, which is when Jason shows up, loudly talking about how he sure hopes nobody kills the kids to retaliate against him. Ooh. Poor timing. So Medea rises out of the house and into the air in Helios' flying chariot, using a bit of stagecraft usually reserved for the gods, by the way, and she taunts Jason that he'll never reach her up here and she's successfully taken everything from him. Jason yells about how he probably should have taken Medea's willingness to betray her family for him as a red flag. He also says that the souls of their children will avenge him on her, but Medea says the gods know who really messed up in this situation, and she's gonna go bury their kids in Hera's sacred lands before purifying herself of the crime, presumably with Kirke's help again, and then heading to Athens for a nice long nap. And meanwhile, she prophesizes that Jason's gonna die a miserable death crushed under the ruins of his only heroic achievement. Jason swears that an avenging fury will destroy her, and Medea tells him good luck finding one that'll listen to a liar and an oathbreaker, and flies away. Jason leaves, asking the gods to avenge him, and the play closes out with the chorus singing that the gods don't always give us what we want. Honestly, hilarious. Sure enough, Medea remains conspicuously unsmote and makes sporadic appearances in later mythology, heading to Athens and marrying Aegeus fairly happily until his son Theseus shows up and she tries to kill him a little bit and runs off to a nebulous faraway land. Medea quietly vanishes into the mythos, never even canonically dying. Her story seems to vindicate that despite all the familicide and the poisoning and stuff, she really did retain the favor of the gods right up to the end, framing her as a bizarrely morally nuanced figure. And in contrast, Jason, well, things really don't go so hot for Jason. As you may recall, his whole hero's journey really got started when he won the favor of Hera through that secret test of character thing. She was essentially his patron god, and basically the only reason he passed all those proving himself dealios, as well as the only reason Medea falls in love with him. Well, Hera was the goddess of marriage and family, and then Jason betrayed his wife. Medea wasn't just sassing when she called him an oathbreaker, he was quite literally breaking a divine oath by abandoning her and their children. Without the favor of Hera, Jason dies alone and unhappy when the rotting prow of the Argo breaks off and crushes him in his sleep, a crumbling monument to his only heroic achievement. Jason and Medea are a classic tragedy that hits surprisingly hard. They were in love, they were heroes, they did incredible things, and then when the situation changed, their very human flaws tore them apart. Two characters who were heroes in one context become nightmares in another. Reading the Argonautica is a genuinely very weird experience, seeing the beginning of their relationship knowing how terribly it's going to end, and you can kind of tell it was written with that in mind. There are a few little tidbits of Medea's character that seem like they're deliberately written there to make the impact of the original tragedy hit harder. Jason could have never succeeded in his quest without Medea, but because of all the murderiness of Medea's methods, he ended up failing to win the throne he'd been after in the first place, driving him to further extremes to try and claim the royalty he deserved. Jason loved Medea, but not more than he wanted the future he'd been after, and in casting her aside, he made a terrible enemy. And Medea was always brilliantly clever, and she loved Jason very fiercely. She had no other choice thanks to Hera, and she loved their children in a way Jason didn't. Throughout the play, he only ever calls them her children until they're dead, and then suddenly they're his children and he feels really bad about it. In a better time, in a better situation, they probably could have been happy together for the rest of their lives, if only Jason weren't such an absolute dingus. Oh yeah, I'll just ditch my incredibly cunning and powerful sorceress wife for this random princess. I'm sure she'll be cool with it. What could possibly go wrong?
The Age of the Argonauts comes to a close with the death of Jason, but the ancient Greek world wouldn't stay boring for long. The lives of the next generation of heroes, the last generation of heroes, were going to be irrevocably shaped by one singular word: wrath. Sing, O goddess, of the wrath of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, who cost the Achaeans countless lives, hurling down to the house of Hades so many sturdy souls. So begins the Iliad, quite possibly the most famous epic poem in the world. It's a song, a tragedy, and a treatise on the destructive power of fury. It's no accident that the first word is menin, wrath. The Iliad is the story of wrath, of Achilles, of the gods, of me and myself for making it the first big project I illustrated on this channel, and thus by consequence the worst video I've ever made that hurts me to think about even though it was a valuable experience without which the channel wouldn't exist as it is now. It's a very emotionally loaded text, basically. And there's a reason it's so well liked. It's genuinely an incredibly good story. Barring a few boat lists, it's a masterfully crafted ride, absolutely loaded up with dramatic irony and emotional stakes. But it's also just a thin slice of a much larger story. The Iliad takes place in the final days of the 10-year Trojan War, but the Trojan War is a much bigger beast than just what Homer retold. So today let's pull together a big pile of sources and talk about the bigger picture. The placement of dominoes that'll eventually topple into the Trojan War begins with the birth of Helen of Troy, previously just Helen. This is also one of the pieces of the story that has the least consistency across different versions, since practically speaking, all that matters is that she exists, not the specifics of where she comes from. In the Iliad and Odyssey, Helen is the daughter of the Spartan king Tyndareus and his wife Leda, and her brothers are Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, a pair of badass horse-riding twins and the subject of the constellation Gemini. This family lineup is corroborated in Pseudo-Apollodorus' Bibliotheca with the additional detail that Leda's children are the result of a wild night where she slept with both Zeus and Tyndareus, with Zeus in the form of a swan, a concept that was bizarrely popular with Renaissance artists and perverts of all stripes. This biological nightmare produced 4 children, with Pollux and Helen, the semi-divine children of Zeus, and Castor and Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's future wife and axe murderer, as the fully mortal children of Tyndareus. Helen's parentage continues to be disputed in the lost epic The Kypria, where it's suggested that Helen was adopted by Leda, but was actually the child of Nemesis, the Greek goddess of divine retribution for hubris. Now that kinda reframes the whole thing, doesn't it? Some of these stories also state that Helen hatched from an egg on account of the whole Zeus was a swan at the time thing, and in Pausanias' descriptions of Greece, he describes a temple that contains shards of the eggshell that Leda supposedly laid. Look, I let a lot of this stuff slide, but that's weird, right? Anyway, skipping ahead a couple decades, the next domino is the marriage of Helen. Helen is, according to some sources, the most beautiful woman in the world, and is thus unsurprisingly a very desirable bride, and a whole bunch of Greek kings roll up in Sparta to try and claim her hand. The exact roster varies a lot depending on who's telling it, but you better believe those storytellers love them some tedious lists. Anyway, specifics aside, Tyndareus is pretty worried about having this many big personalities competing for his daughter out on his front lawn, and he's extra worried that picking one of them might make things exponentially worse and trigger a full-on war when the rest of the suitors get cranky about being snubbed. This is when one of the suitors sidles up to him, a young man by the name of Odysseus, and he offers to help Tyndareus resolve his little suitor problem if he helps him with something else, by putting in a good word for him with the Spartan king Icarius so Odysseus can woo his daughter Penelope. Tyndareus agrees, and Odysseus suggests that Tyndareus make all the suitors swear a binding oath to protect the winner's marriage against any kind of interference, so that none of them can try to grab Helen and run off without the rest of them declaring war. The suitors agree to the oath, and Tyndareus ends up choosing Menelaus for Helen, represented in absentia by Agamemnon, who must have been on his absolute best behavior to make that kind of a good impression, and the rest of the suitors pack up and go home, though not before Tyndareus keeps his word and arranges for Penelope and Odysseus to get together. In Euripides' Hecuba, the format of the oath is the same, with the minor change that Tyndareus lets Helen choose her own husband, and she chooses Menelaus. Very egalitarian. But meanwhile, somewhere completely different, the gods are setting up a domino of their own. According to Pseudo-Apollodorus' Bibliotheca, Eris, goddess of it's getting a little too chummy around here, wakes up one morning and chooses violence, lobbing an apple at Athena, Aphrodite, and Hera, and saying it's a prize for whichever one of them is the most beautiful. The Roman author Hyginus adds a little more detail in his text Fabulae by specifying that this is happening at the wedding of Achilles' parents, and Eris is pissed she didn't get an invite. Zeus recognizes disaster when he sees it and quickly has Hermes tow the goddesses somewhere very far away to work things out, so he takes them to Mount Ida, where Trojan prince Paris is hanging out. Paris has had an eventful childhood of his own at this point. In Hyginus' Fabulae again, it's briefly mentioned that Paris' mother Hecuba had a dream where she gave birth to a burning torch that exploded into snakes, and everyone agreed that was a bad omen and a half, so when the baby was born, they handed him off to a servant to kill him. The servants chose the much more humane option of dumping him on a mountain to die, but luckily he's rescued by some shepherds who take him in. A few years and several shenanigans later, Paris reclaims his status as prince, and everyone accepts him back with open arms, because it's probably fine, right? It'd be crazy if this random kid was single-handedly responsible for triggering the downfall of Troy. Anyway, that's been Paris' life so far, and meanwhile, back in the present, Hermes tells him to pick which goddess gets the apple. Each goddess offers Paris an incentive to vote for her. Hera promises to make him king of the world, Athena offers him glory and victory in battle, and Aphrodite promises him Helen as his wife. Paris chooses Aphrodite and sails off to Sparta to collect his already married prize, while Hera and Athena start plotting revenge. In the Kypria, the story continues, with Paris and company
company first hosted by the Dioscuri and then by Menelaus and Helen. When Menelaus has to leave for Crete, Aphrodite intervenes to get Helen and Paris together, and they load up Paris' ships with stolen treasures and sail off into the night. Despite a storm sent by a pissed-off Hera, possibly due to her role as the goddess of marriage, Paris and Helen make it to Troy and are married. However, this version of the story isn't quite universal. In Euripides' play Helen, the Helen that Paris brings to Troy and marries is actually an illusion crafted and brought to life by Hera, while the real Helen is brought to Egypt to keep her safe during the war. Pseudo-Apollodorus' Bibliotheca also mentions this version, so it must have been decently well known. Anyway, the questionably consensual abduction of Helen kicks off the next big step in the process, namely the mustering of armies. See, all of Helen's former suitors are still bound by that oath to defend her marriage, so pretty much every important Greek king is now honor-bound to go storm the gates of Troy and get Helen back. In the Kypria, Menelaus is informed of Helen's loss by the goddess Iris and returns home to get Agamemnon to start mustering an army. They go collect the various Greek kings who are honor-bound to side with them, and also Achilles, who, unlike the rest of them, doesn't actually have to be there since he was too young / too not even born yet to be one of Helen's suitors, so he's not bound by the oath. It's referenced briefly in the Iliad that Achilles' mother Thetis prophesied that if he went to Troy he would definitely die there, but his name would be remembered forever. But if he stayed out of it, he'd live a very long life but die in obscurity. He chose to join the Greek kings and storm Troy for the immortality of glory, not because he had to be there. In contrast, Odysseus does have to be there, but really doesn't want to be there. In the years since the marriage of Helen, he and Penelope have gotten married and had a baby son, so now he has a lot to lose. In order to escape his own oath, he pretends to have gone mad, but gives it up when Agamemnon threatens his son, because Agamemnon's a real piece of shit. Who knew? The gang reluctantly muster at Aulis and prepare to sail for Troy, but then Agamemnon pisses off Artemis for no reason and she sets the wind against them. Euripides' tragic play Iphigenia in Aulis recounts this part of the timeline. The only way to appease Artemis is for Agamemnon to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia, which he feels briefly bad about and then does almost immediately. However, in the Kypria, Artemis actually spirits Iphigenia away and makes her immortal, replacing her on the altar with a deer, which is nice of her. With Artemis appeased, the wind turns and the fleet can officially sail for Troy. The surviving summaries of the Kypria explain in brief what happens when they arrive in Troy. A few minor skirmishes happen, the Achaeans send a message to Troy demanding the return of Helen and the stolen treasure, Troy tells him to get stuffed, and the war begins. Achilles pretty much single-handedly sacks the surrounding towns, and the Achaeans besiege Troy. This part of the process evidently takes about 9 years, but it's 9 years of ferocious ass-kicking that basically destroys every part of Troy that's not safely behind the walls. Zeus decides to give the Trojans a break and works out a plan to take Achilles out of the equation for a little while, and that's how we get the Iliad. Hey, it's me, narrator Red again. I know it's gauche for me to interrupt the video mid-summary, but this part of the Trojan War video is what I affectionately refer to as the Iliad speedrun any %. I did it like this because I already made a video that was a detailed summary of the Iliad and I didn't want to retread old ground. However, since this is a compilation, it's only right that I include the contents of that video for the sake of completeness and the detailed adventures of this generation of heroes. But the Iliad is also the first video I ever illustrated on this channel. I made it in my very first quarter of college as a way to trick my brain into paying attention in class. It's 9 years old, and I am reluctant to include it in this compilation. But I'm also not a coward, so here we go. The Iliad is one monster of a book. It's more than 600 pages long, and the crazy part was it used to be passed down through oral tradition, meaning it was someone's job to memorize the damn thing and regurgitate it into the willing ears of whoever was listening. On top of that, if I had to guess how many named characters were in it, I'd put the number somewhere between 200 and too many. Luckily for us, though, there's only a few characters we actually need to care about. On the Trojan side, those are Hector, Paris, and Helen. And on the Greek side, we've got Achilles, Patroclus, Odysseus, Agamemnon, boo, Menelaus, Diomedes, Ajax the Greater, and Ajax the Lesser, along with a few others. Now, back in the day, Troy was called Ilias, which is why the book is called the Iliad. Translated literally, it'd be called Troy Story.
You got a friend in me.
Yeah. Book 1. So our story begins 9 years into the Trojan War, when Agamemnon makes the dumbest decision of his life and pisses off Achilles, the most powerful warrior in his entire army. Basically, Agamemnon had taken this girl Chryseis prisoner, and her father, a priest of Apollo, came to try and get her back. He offered Agamemnon untold riches or whatever, which Agamemnon turned down on the principle of being an asshole. So predictably enough, this powerful and desperate priest of Apollo prayed to the god in question, who gladly started raining down plagues upon the Greek army. Agamemnon is somehow surprised that pissing off this super powerful deity could go so badly for him, but still refuses to return the girl until Achilles starts verbally slapping him around, to the point that Athena has to physically come down and stop him from straight up murdering his commanding officer. By the way, you may have noticed that there seem to be an awful lot of gods in this story. No, you ain't seen nothing yet. So Agamemnon finally agrees to return the girl to her father, but there's one condition. Achilles will, in exchange, have to give Agamemnon his chosen lady toy, a gorgeous lass named Briseis. Achilles, though thoroughly bummed, does the smart thing and gives her up. Then he does the not smart thing and refuses to fight. He curls up into a sulky blanket burrito in his tent and refuses to come out for anything. Now, Achilles is by far the most powerful Greek warrior among them, later myths even painting him as invincible, so this is a pretty hefty loss for the Greek forces. Achilles then proceeds to make things even worse for them by praying to his mom, a minor goddess named Thetis, to get Zeus to help the Trojans. That's right, he's so pissed at Agamemnon that he's willing to make them lose the war out of spite. Of course, since I also hate Agamemnon, this doesn't really bother me all that much, but still, not cool, bro. Book 2. So, Zeus, as we all know, likes nothing better than screwing with mortals, so he's all for this plan. He sends a dream to Agamemnon urging him to attack Troy full force and promising him victory. So Agamemnon's like, great idea! Nothing bad has ever come from me listening to the gods! And then Hector hears a similar message from Zeus and immediately marshals his forces to attack. Book 3 is a list. It's just a list. The person rattling off the list is Helen, who punctuates her description of the Greeks with a lot of self-loathing commentary. But wait, this book actually has some action. Shock, I know. Menelaus, Helen's real husband, challenges Paris, Helen's current husband, to a duel. Paris is all for this plan, but there's just one problem. Paris is a total wimp. Menelaus kicks his ass, but before he can kill him and solve the war for good, Aphrodite decides to intervene and whisk Paris off the battlefield and off to Helen's chambers. Helen's like, God damn it, Aphrodite, what do you want? And Aphrodite's like, now kiss! Side note. That interaction pretty much summarizes the entire dynamic between Paris, Helen, and Aphrodite. The story's a little more complicated than this, but basically, Aphrodite promised Paris the hand of the most beautiful woman in the world in exchange for a golden apple. Specifically, the golden apple of discord crafted by Ares, goddess of discord, who was pissed after not getting invited to a wedding. The other two contenders for the golden apple were Athena and Hera, who you'd think would have better things to do. He accepted, and Aphrodite held up her end of the bargain by kidnapping Helen from her comfortable life as Menelaus' wife and delivering her to Paris, although some versions involve Paris kidnapping her himself. So basically, at this point, Aphrodite has done nothing but mess up Helen's life, and the whole war is also kind of her fault, so it's no surprise that nobody in the story really likes her that much. Anyway, back to the actual plot. So back on the battlefield, Menelaus is an unholy degree of pissed, riding in circles, frothing at the mouth, yelling, "Come back here and die like a man!" You know the works. So then in Book 4, the gods discuss what to do and decide that abject chaos is way more fun than peaceful resolution. So Athena pops down into the Trojan ranks and double dog dares an archer to shoot at Menelaus. The arrow whiffs, the temporary truce between the two armies immediately dissolves, and they all go back to wailing on each other. So Book 5 is all about this lesser-known but incredibly badass Greek hero, Diomedes. So Diomedes is tearing through the Trojan army, you know, like you do, when Athena notices that two gods she particularly dislikes, Aphrodite and Ares, happen to be interfering with the battle. So she pops down to Diomedes like, "Hey, so I've given you magic eyeballs. Now you can tell who's secretly a god and who's not. And let me be clear about this. Do not fight the gods. You will lose. Unless it's Aphrodite, then fight all you want. She's somewhere between marshmallow fluff and a baby chick in terms of battle prowess." So Diomedes acknowledges and continues to tear his way through the army, when suddenly he sees Aphrodite doing her thing and lifting one of her injured dudes off the battlefield. Diomedes is like, "None of that!" and chucks a spear through her wrist. So she's like, "Ow!" and drops the dude in question and zips back to Olympus, whining incessantly. Meanwhile, back at the front, Apollo grabs the dude Aphrodite was trying to save. His name is Aeneas, by the way. He's got his own book or something, I don't know. And Diomedes immediately tries to stab him. Apollo's like, "Step off, kid. Some of us gods are a little sturdier than Aphrodite." And Diomedes does the smart thing and backs off. And then Ares shows up. Yay! So Athena's like, "Diomedes, why aren't you hitting him?" And he's like, "Because you told me not to?" And she's like, "Forget what I said, kid. You're the best around!" And then Diomedes stabs Ares in the gut, which video game logic tells me must make him the new god of war. So Ares runs home to Zeus crying, and Zeus is like, "Man up, you gigantic disappointment!" So now Ares hurts on the outside and the inside. Book 6 is pretty boring. Someone tells Hector to tell the women of Troy to pray to Athena to stop Diomedes from single-handedly killing every single one of them. So he does, and they do, but she doesn't, and he continues to be awesome. Book 7 is a little more interesting. Apollo's like, "Hey Athena, you know what would be cool? If your chosen hero didn't end the war in one day. That'd be cool, right?" And Athena's like, "You make an excellent point. Let's stop the war and make Hector fight someone." So they pause the war again. You know, I really don't think it should be that easy. And the various Greek heroes we actually care about hold an impromptu lottery to see who gets to fight Hector. Great Ajax, not to be confused with lesser Ajax, wins the lottery, and he and Hector duke it out until nightfall, at which point they both call it a day and go home. So Book 8 is called The Tide of Battle Turns, and that's basically what happens. The Greeks start losing and the Trojans start winning. Now it's time for Book 9. So Agamemnon's like, "Damn it! It's almost like we're missing our strongest fighter and the gods are working against us. What do you know?" So Agamemnon's like, "I vote we run away. Who wants to run away?" And Diomedes is like, "You've got to be kidding me. You called us cowards and now you want us to cut and run? God, this guy is so cool." So Agamemnon's like, no. What I meant to say was, who wants to go talk to Achilles and get him to fight with us again?" So he sends Ajax and Odysseus to talk to Achilles, who's still burritoed up in his tent with Patroclus. So Ajax and Odysseus are like, yo, Agamemnon's willing to give you your girlfriend back, along with a ridiculous amount of wealth and a few kingdoms if you get out there and help us fight. And Achilles is like, nope, he's a jerk. In fact, I sail home tomorrow unless something really tragic and unnecessary happens to make me stay and fight. Hey, if it isn't my best buddy Patroclus. I don't know what I'd do if this guy died. That, folks, is what we in the writing biz call foreshadowing. Book 10 is basically a Metal Gear Solid mission. Not even kidding. So it's night, and Agamemnon and Menelaus gather some main characters and are like, okay, do we have some volunteers to infiltrate the Trojan camp and find out their plans? And Diomedes is like, well, I did just finish carving a bloody canyon through the Trojan forces, so sure, I'm game. And Odysseus is like, you'll want me as well. I have actual cognitive faculties, quite rare among this army. So Odysseus, the only sneaky guy in the entire Greek army, gets partnered up with my man Diomedes for a stealth mission. That's right, this epic officially has everything now. But at the same time, in the Trojan camp, Hector has the same idea, and sends a much less important character to scout the Greek ships. Predictably enough, the two stealth teams encounter each other, and Diomedes and Odysseus capture and interrogate the poor guy. He's like, I'll tell you everything! And Odysseus is like, huh, ballin'. And then they decapitate him. Using the information Odysseus extracted from him, they sneak into the Trojan camp and steal an extremely fancy chariot and some armor from a king.
Excellent, Snake.
Now it's time for Book 11. The sun rises and it's back to war we go. So today is Agamemnon's time to shine, and while he's busy kicking ass and taking names, some minor hero that Achilles is fond of gets wounded. So Achilles is like, hey Patroclus, can you go out there and ask Nestor who that was? I need to make sure before I start feeling sad. So Patroclus does, and Nestor's like, hey, so it sure is nice of Achilles to feel bad when his friends start getting hurt. But, it'd be even better if, he helped out so that didn't happen. So yeah, could you maybe have a talk with him about that? And Patroclus is like, I only promise to try. Book 12, the war continues. Zeus smacks the Greeks with a thunderstorm, allowing the Trojans to start beating them. Man, divine intervention is such a hack. So this pushes the Greeks all the way back to the ships. And in Book 13, Poseidon gets a little sick of Zeus hogging the show, so he drops by to give the Greeks a little help by buffing the two Ajaxes with some stat boosts. So then the Greeks start winning. In Book 14, Hera uses her feminine wiles to distract Zeus from his efforts to buff the Trojans and depower the Greeks, so the Greek army continues to win. In Book 15, Zeus wakes up after being thoroughly wiled by Hera and gets mega pissed to see that his favored side is now losing. Ares is like, hey, I think one of my kids down there just died. This looks like a lovely excuse for war. And Athena dope slaps the armor off him like, idiot, Zeus is already mad enough. If you remind him how much of a failure you are, he'll get even madder. And Ares is like, oh. So the tide of battle turns again, and the Trojans start winning. At this point, it's really become formulaic. By the time Book 16 rolls around, Patroclus has gotten back to Achilles like, hey, dude, could I maybe persuade you to go out and fight? Our guys are kind of getting destroyed. I mean, even Agamemnon is injured. And Achilles is like, ha, nice. And Patroclus is like, seriously, Achilles, they're dying out there. They need our help. And Achilles is like, well, I really can't have them burn our ships. Tell you what, you go out in my armor and lead my army. The Trojans will never know the difference between us. And Patroclus is like, anything for you, man. And Achilles is like, just one thing. Promise me you'll come back alive. And Patroclus is like, of course I will, bro. And not 5 minutes later, Hector kills him. Book 17 is pretty uneventful. The Greeks see Patroclus go down and collectively hulk out to defend his body, and Hector takes Achilles' armor and wears it around. Book 18, the battle continues, although now it's centered around defending Patroclus' corpse. Meanwhile, Achilles is still burritoed up in his tent, having no idea that his bestie is currently dead. That is, until a messenger arrives bearing those very tidings, causing Achilles to similarly hulk out. He's like, that's it, time to single-handedly kick Troy's ass! And his mom Thetis is like, no, Achilles, you're fated to die if you fight! And he's like, I couldn't save my hetero life partner, Mom, this life isn't worth living anymore! And then the rest of the chapter is devoted to Hephaestus making Achilles new duds. In Book 19, Achilles puts on his new duds. Yeah, this epic kind of drags on in places. In Book 20, Achilles carves a bloody murder canyon through the Trojan forces despite various gods' best attempts to stop him. In Book 21, Achilles fills a river with so many corpses that the river itself gets pissed and starts trying to drown him, so he beats it up until it stops bothering him. Then he gets distracted and starts chasing Apollo around the city because all the best heroes have ADD. Just ask any side-questing Skyrim player. In Book 22, Achilles finally remembers what he's there for, and after an extremely slapstick routine where he chases Hector around Troy several times, he finally kills him. Yay! Then he ties Hector's body to his chariot and rides it around Troy 3 times to parade the body off to Hector's father, the king. Yay? And the rest of the book is, actually pretty boring. The Greeks hold Patroclus' funeral, during which they basically just play a lot of party games. And then, at some point after the Iliad cuts off, but before they officially sack Troy, Achilles gets shot in the heel by Paris and dies. Yay!
Ooh, that was a plunge into ice water. But now that the details are out of the way, let's remove ourselves from the ice bath and get back into the Trojan War, which obviously sucked for everybody, but at least it's better drawn. This is why I cut the old Iliad video into the middle of the Trojan War video. Imagine if we'd gone through all my nice, clean, new art, and then I was like, hey, now that that's out of the way, let's check out the best that 2015 Red could do. So anyway, let's get out of the summary and back to the summary's summary.
To very quickly speed through it, during the raiding around Troy, most of the Achaeans picked up bride prizes, which was a nice way of saying enslaved Trojan women for them to bone. Achilles' bride prize is Briseis, a character with basically no character who, surprisingly, does seem to actually get along okay with Achilles and Patroclus. She's very upset when Patroclus dies, spoiler alert, and mentions that he promised to make Achilles marry her when they returned from Troy, while Agamemnon's bride prize is Chryseis, the daughter of Chryses, a Trojan priest of Apollo. Chryses tries to buy his daughter's freedom with a kingly ransom, but Agamemnon tells Chryses he's going to enjoy making sure Chryseis is too busy boning him and making him sandwiches to ever see her homeland again. Chryses prays to Apollo for help, and Apollo deems Agamemnon a huge dickweasel and rains divine arrows down on the Achaeans, killing a whole bunch of them. The Achaeans figure out Agamemnon pissed off Apollo by dishonoring his priest, and the only way to make him stop killing everyone is to give back Chryseis, which Agamemnon refuses to do unless he's given a replacement slave woman right now, because obviously that's so much more important than winning the actual war he's there to win. So he takes Briseis from Achilles. This royally antagonizes Achilles, so he bundles up in his sulky blanket burrito and hides in his tent, while the Achaeans get absolutely slaughtered without him. With Achilles off the field, the Trojan hero Hector has nobody to counterbalance him, so the Trojans actually start winning for a change. Long story short, that's basically how things continue until Patroclus is killed by Hector, and Achilles' grief and rage finally motivate him to rejoin the battle, at which point he pretty much immediately kills Hector and completely turns the tide of the war. And that's basically the Iliad, minus a couple Metal Gear jokes. The events after the Iliad are recounted in a few places, one of them being Quintus Smyrnaeus' Post-Homerica, which covers the death of Achilles and the final days of the Trojan War. It also features an ass-kicking Amazon princess, Penthesilea, daughter of Ares, who rolls up to Troy pursued by the Furies for accidentally killing her sister and decides to sublimate her many issues by slaughtering as many Achaeans as she can get her hands on, which she does so effectively it briefly sparks an honest-to-God feminist revolution in the Trojan women. Achilles isn't there to stop her because he's too busy crying on top of Patroclus' grave, but when he catches wind of the slaughter, he gears up, heads to the battlefield, and kills her in one hit. But this doesn't improve his mood, as when he removes her helmet, he finds Penthesilea stunningly beautiful and immediately regrets killing her, instead imagining the life they could have shared if they'd met under literally any other circumstances. The Achaean warrior Thersites pops up to make fun of him for being a lame girl-like in weenie pants, and Achilles smacks him so hard he dies. Weird chapter. Anyway, later on we get the death of Achilles, which is unfortunately very inconsistent across its many sources. The Post-Homerica, for instance, credits his death to Apollo himself, who violates Zeus's dubiously enforced no-interference policy and shoots Achilles in the heel with a poisoned arrow. In Pseudo-Apollodorus' Bibliotheca, meanwhile, Achilles is shot in the heel by Paris being guided by Apollo. And in Ovid's Metamorphoses, Paris shoots Achilles with Apollo's help, but they're being motivated by Poseidon, who's pissed as hell that Achilles killed one of his sons earlier in the war. In the Iliad, Hector prophesies that Achilles will be killed by Paris with Apollo's help, so that's probably the most generally consistent version, but ultimately the how doesn't matter so much. All that matters is Achilles dies in Troy, just like his mother prophesies. It's also interesting to note that none of these versions specify that Achilles' heel is his only weakness or that he's indestructible everywhere else, and while that's a fun bit of folklore, it seems to have popped up after Homer and isn't really part of the original Trojan cycle. But it's still cool, so, whatever. Fun fact, according to Sophocles' play Ajax, this is also where Ajax dies after he loses to Odysseus at the funeral games for Achilles' armor and kills himself in shame. Fun. The Post-Homerica also explains how Paris dies, embarrassingly. He's shot by Philoctetes with 2 poisoned arrows, one of which hits him in the dick, which I think we can all agree is the true villain of this story. Paris tries to get his wife Oenone, a nymph, to heal him, but she's pretty livid he abandoned her for Helen and refuses, so he dies, and Priam is too busy mourning Hector to notice. I'd feel bad for the guy, but I don't. Anyway, with almost all the major players dead, the war winds down, culminating in the final domino, the Trojan horse. This part of the story is recounted in detail in both the Odyssey and the Aeneid, though the Aeneid goes into a little more detail. With Athena's help, the Greeks build a massive wooden horse and several of them hide inside, while the rest burn their camp and sail away to make the Trojans think they're retreating. The Trojans are overjoyed that the siege is finally over and swarm out of the city and into the abandoned camp, finding it empty except for this giant wooden horse. There's a lot of debate over what to do with it, and one dude, Laocoon, a seer and priest of Apollo, is actually appropriately worried about this seemingly spontaneous retreat and yells that they should really know Odysseus' tricks by now. He even hucks a spear into the side of the horse to make his point. The Trojans also find and capture one remaining Achaean, a dude named Sinon, who spins a very compelling sob story about being left behind as a sacrifice paralleling Iphigenia to allow the rest of the Achaeans to sail home. The horse, he explains, was built to win back favor from Athena, who was furious at Odysseus and Diomedes for stealing her sacred statue, the Palladium, from Troy. Sinon warns the Trojans that because the horse is very definitely sacred to Athena, they absolutely cannot destroy destroy it or damage it in any way, but if they take it into the city, it might bring them the same good fortune that the Palladium used to. And to really sell the bit, the gods send a bunch of snakes to kill Laocoon and his sons. Thoroughly convinced that damaging the horse is a very bad idea, the Trojans lug it into the city, naturally over Cassandra's protests, and that night Sinon unlocks the horse and releases the warriors within, who swarm out and sack Troy, burning it to the ground. The version in the Odyssey is very similar, but it's recounted from Menelaus' perspective inside the horse, and he adds that Helen was suspicious of the horse and went around the outside knocking on it, addressing the Achaeans by name while impersonating the voices of their wives, which is pretty devious. Odysseus just barely managed to keep the others from blowing their cover through basic logic and the occasional application of CQC. The horse plan works, the Achaeans successfully sack Troy, and it's a happy ending for everyone. Kind of. Really, it's a happy ending for almost no one. Between the Iliad and the Odyssey, there's one more lost epic called the Nostoi, a text so fragmentary we only have 5.5 lines from it. Oh, it hurts. Anyway, the Nostoi seems to have told the story of the various surviving Greek heroes returning home from Troy, minus our boys Odysseus and Aeneas, of course, who get their own elaborate epilogues later on. This is an important intermediate bit that most of the later stories technically serve as sequels to. For instance, Aeschylus' Oresteia follows after Agamemnon returning home, and in the Odyssey, Telemachus visits Menelaus after he made it home with Helen, a story that's partially recounted in Euripides' play Helen. But at this point, the Trojan War is basically fully wrapped up. 99% of everyone is dead, Troy's been burned to the ground, Agamemnon's about to get murdered, and all is finally right with the world. You know, I bet when Odysseus was stuck out in Troy fighting for 10 long years, and then when he was lost at sea for another 10 years, he probably really appreciated the irony that the whole mess was technically his fault.
The Trojan War was a proving ground for the final generation of great heroes, but it also killed most of them. They didn't have monsters to fight or evil kings to thwart in search of proving themselves. Their last enemy was each other. In the closing age of Greek heroes, only one man got down in the dirt and faced the same primeval threats that the first age of heroes had conquered. One absolute unlucky bastard who incurred the wrath of the gods, battled monsters and sorceresses, and shockingly, survived. So let's dive back into the ice bath of 2015 one last time and dredge up the Odyssey.
So, the Odyssey, or as I like to identify it, Troy Story 2, is something of a sequel to the Iliad, chronicling the various happily ever afters, or otherwise, of our favorite Greek heroes. But really, what it's mostly about is how much the universe hates Odysseus and wants him to suffer for as long as humanly possible. Seriously, in the 10 years it takes him to get from Troy to Ithaca, this guy gets put through more crap than a 20-pound bag of industrial-strength Huggies sized for incontinent bulls. So the Odyssey begins with our hero, who's been stranded on an island for 7 years with no company other than a gorgeous, lonely, immortal goddess by the name of Calypso. Terrible, right? Well, actually, it does kind of suck for him, because what he wants more than anything is to get back home to Ithaca, specifically back to his lovely wife Penelope and his now adult son Telemachus, who Odysseus hasn't seen since he was a baby. And in fact, the story initially focuses on these two. See, since almost everyone thinks Odysseus is dead, Penelope is now widely considered to be Ithaca's most eligible bachelorette, and as a result, she's got more than 100 potential suitors queuing up in her castle, demanding that she pick one of them to marry her and become the new king. Her son Telemachus is none too pleased about the suitors throwing a never-ending frat party in his house. Now, by the time our story begins, most of the gods have decided that poor Odysseus has suffered enough at this point, so Athena disguises herself as a dude, drops down into Ithaca, and then tells Telemachus, "Hey, your dad's alive! Maybe you should go try and find out where he is." So Telemachus, who's a pretty smart kid, immediately figures out that this dude is actually a god, and thus takes her at her word. But before he leaves, Telemachus tries, and fails, to kick the suitors out of his house. And they're like, "Ooh, is widow baby Telemachus gonna fight us?" And Telemachus is like, "Shut up! I'm gonna find my dad and he's gonna beat you up!" So Telemachus secretly assembles a small loyal crew, acquires a ship, and sets off in search of news. The first place he goes is Pylos, home to King Nestor. So Telemachus is like, "Hey, do you have any idea where my father is?" And Nestor's like, "Well, let me think back to when I last saw him. Oh right, it was 9 years ago, during the Trojan War. Agamemnon and Menelaus were arguing, which had split the army down the middle, so Odysseus, Diomedes, Menelaus, and I took our armies and left. Although Odysseus did turn back to head off Agamemnon, and that's the last time I saw him. I don't know what happened after that, though. Maybe you should go talk to Menelaus, see what he has to say about the matter." So Telemachus goes off to Sparta and meets with Menelaus and Helen, now happily remarried, and Telemachus is like, "Yeah, can you tell me where my dad is?" And Menelaus is like, "First, let me tell you my story! Okay, so I was marooned on this tiny island off the coast of Egypt, right? When this goddess shows up, and she's like, 'Hey, you should talk to my dad, Proteus. He'll tell you how to get out of here.' So I went off and tackled the guy, but he starts shape-shifting, right? But he can't shake me that easily. So we got tired of that pretty quick, and he was like, 'Screw it, what do you want?' And I was like, 'Do your thing, oh god of telling me stuff.' And he's like, 'Fine, you're stranded here because you forgot to sacrifice to Zeus before you left. Also, Ajax the Lesser drowned, Agamemnon's dead, and Odysseus is stranded on Calypso's island.' And Telemachus is like, 'That's literally all I needed to hear.' But back in Ithaca, the suitors have learned that Telemachus left to find news of Odysseus, and they find this very offensive for some reason, so they start plotting to kill him as soon as he gets back. Man, Penelope sure knows how to pick him. Now, on Zeus's orders, Calypso finally lets Odysseus go, so he heads off homeward on a raft. But Poseidon, who's holding a grudge against him for reasons that'll be explained later, notices that he's trying to escape and whips up a huge storm in an effort to drown him.
but Odysseus is far too badass to let a little thing like drowning get him down, and he's doing pretty well for himself when yet another goddess shows up, gives him a magic anti-drowning scarf, and then vanishes. And Odysseus is like, huh, why would I need this when I have a perfectly serviceable raft? Okay then. So Odysseus swims all the way to nearby Phaeacia, drags himself into the forest, and passes out. So Athena, always looking out for Odysseus, zips over to the city and tells the princess Nausicaa, hey, you should go down to the forest. And she's like, great idea. So she heads over to the forest and finds Odysseus, just like Athena planned. So Nausicaa brings him back to her parents, the king and queen, and Odysseus tells them the story of how he came to be stranded on Calypso's island. So it's just after the Greeks have sacked Troy, and Odysseus advises the others to quit while they're ahead and sail back to Greece. But of course they don't listen to him, and by next morning they're overrun by a retaliatory force. Odysseus and some of the others take the ships to escape, but Zeus is angry at the Greeks for their poor sportsmanship and sends a huge storm to blow them off course. Odysseus and his crew are swept far out to sea, and that's when the weird stuff starts happening. So first, they wash up at the land of the Lotus Eaters, which is populated by these really mellow dudes who eat lotuses. Anyone who eats a lotus mellows out and wants to stay there forever, so of course most of his shipmates eat them, and Odysseus has to drag his idiot crew back to the ships by force. So they set out again, only to wash up on the island of the Cyclopses, where they see a nice-looking cave surrounded by delicious-looking flocks of sheep. Unfortunately, the cave is home to a large, hungry Cyclops by the name of Polyphemus, who seals them in with an enormous rock, kills 2 of the crew, and then falls asleep. Since they can't kill him without trapping themselves in the cave, they bide their time until the next night, when Odysseus gets Polyphemus drunk, introduces himself as nobody, and then when Polyphemus passes out, they take a large wooden stake and stab out his eye. So Polyphemus is like,
Help! Nobody blinded me!
and all his Cyclops friends are like,
Yeah, you're hilarious. Polyphemus, is nobody stealing your flocks too?
So Polyphemus opens the cave to check, and Odysseus and remaining crew bolt for the ships. Then Odysseus, remember the wisest of the Greeks, takes it into his head to taunt the Cyclops. So he's like, hey, guess what, dumbass? My name's not nobody. It's Odysseus. And Polyphemus is like,
Dad, Odysseus gouged out my eye.
So funny story. All Cyclopses are children of Poseidon. So Poseidon hears about this, and he's like, oh, really? Time for some disproportionate retribution. So after that point, he starts trying to make Odysseus' journey home just as difficult as godly possible. So after that little adventure, they land on the Aeolian island, where the king very nicely gives them a magic leather pouch full of wind to speed them on their way home. But we can't give Odysseus a break just yet. They're maybe 10 feet off the coast of Ithaca when his idiot crew decides that the magic bag has gold in it and busts it open. The resulting hurricane sweeps them all the way back to the Aeolian island. So Odysseus is like, hey, got another one of those magic wind bags? But the king's like, not for you, dude. You've got to be super cursed to have that bad luck. Get off my island. So next they arrive on the Lastrygonian island, populated entirely by cannibal giants. When they start eating the majority of Odysseus' crew, Odysseus and the other survivors get out of there as fast as humanly possible. Next on this mythological island world tour, they come to the Aeaean island, where Circe, the daughter of Helios, lives. Circe is a sorceress, and some wicked hankering for bacon makes her take it into her head to turn Odysseus' rapidly dwindling crew into pigs. Odysseus learns of their tragic swinification and resolves to rescue them. So Hermes gives Odysseus some anti-magic drugs so that Circe won't be able to enchant him. You know, for someone who the gods supposedly hate, Odysseus sure does seem to get a lot of help from them. So Circe's like, here, have some enchanted booze, and Odysseus is like, awesome, drinks it, fails to turn into a pig, and then draws a sword on her. So she's like, wait, I'm a mage, I have like 2 hit points, and he's like, then I suggest you turn them back before I have to whittle that number down to 0. So she does, and then they all chillax on the island for like a year. So then Odysseus is like, yeah, we should probably be getting back, and Circe's like, well, fine with me, but first you gotta go talk to Tiresias. I mean, he's the one who knows how to get you home. Oh yeah? Where can I find him? He's dead. So Odysseus and crew sail down to Hades. They do this wacky ghost summoning ritual which ends up attracting a few other ghosts they weren't looking for, and then Tiresias shows up. He's like, what's up, Odysseus? Poseidon's determined to screw you over, but you all might make it back as long as you don't harm Helios' pet cows that can be found on Thrinacia. If you do, though, your entire crew will die and you'll be home, like, super late. And Odysseus is like, cool, you heard the man, folks. No hurting the cows. Then Odysseus has a little touching reunion with the ghosts of all his now-dead Greek war buddies, like Agamemnon, very grumpy at being dead, Achilles and Patroclus, now hetero-death partners, and great Ajax. Then Odysseus sails out of Hades and back to Aeaea, where Circe maps out the route back to Ithaca, which for some reason is extremely densely populated by monsters. So first, they find the island of the Sirens, who sing so beautifully that anyone who hears them will be entranced, jump off the boat, and swim to their deaths. So the crew block their ears with beeswax and keep rowing, but Odysseus is really determined to hear their song, so he has them tie him to the mast so he can listen without doing anything stupid. The Sirens are like, and Odysseus is like, release me, I must hear their dulcet tones up close, and his crew is like, what? So they get out of earshot of the Sirens, only to encounter the monsters Scylla and Charybdis. So Scylla is one ugly piece of work. She's a 6-headed monster at the top of a giant craggy cliff, whose heads reach all the way down to the ocean to devour any unfortunates who happen to drift too close. Charybdis is like a combination garbage disposal and malfunctioning garbage disposal that sucks in the ocean and then spits it back out again. So, as they're trying to find a way to sail between the two without running into either the cliff or Charybdis, Scylla eats 6 of his crew members. On the bright side, this means her mouths are full
rolls, so she can't eat any more of them, so Odysseus and crew take the opportunity to gun it between them. They finally come across Thrinacia, more easily pronounced as the Island of the Sun, where, despite Odysseus' prophecy-based protests, they land and rest for the night. But then, Zeus strands them on the island for more than a month. At this point, the food Circe gave them starts to run out, and Eurylochus, a somewhat mutinous crew member who's inexplicably survived everything up till this point, is like, hey, what if we sacrificed one of these lovely golden cows to the gods? We'd get to eat it and leave the island. And Odysseus is like, damn it, what did Tiresias say? And Eurylochus is like, oh wait, too late, I seem to have killed one. So when they finally set sail, Zeus hits the ship with lightning. The boat explodes, the entire crew dies, and Odysseus is left clinging to a single timber from the boat, silently contemplating where everything went wrong. Then, adding insult to injury, Zeus sends a wind to blow Odysseus back to Charybdis, who eats the rest of the boat. A few hours later, when Charybdis pukes up the timber, Odysseus hops onto what's left of the boat and paddles the hell out of there. 9 days later, he washes up on the shore of Calypso's island, and the rest is questionably reliable history. So Odysseus finishes telling his story, and the king is like, dang, dude, want a boat? And Odysseus is like, yes, please. So the king gives him a ship and crew, along with a few tons of fine treasure, and Odysseus naps all the way back to Ithaca. And who can blame him? So that's the end, right? He's made it back to Ithaca, so that's it, right? Nope, we're barely halfway through this book. Come on, give the man a break! So Odysseus is finally home in Ithaca, but there's one small problem. The suitors are still making trouble all up in his backyard. But Athena, as always, has a plan. She magically disguises him as an old man, then goes off to Sparta to bring Telemachus home for the reunion. Odysseus, now disguised, goes off to talk to some loyal swineherd. Meanwhile, in Sparta, Athena's like, yo, Telemachus, get your butt home. So Telemachus sets sail for home, along with several gifts from Menelaus and Helen. Oh, and he's also joined by this dude, Theoclymenus, who's a prophet and a fugitive from Argos. While Odysseus and the swineherd bond, Telemachus and Theoclymenus arrive at Ithaca, and, knowing that the palace isn't necessarily safe for either of them, immediately head off to the friendly neighborhood swineherd's house. So Telemachus is like, swineherd, my man, how are things up at the castle? And the swineherd is like, oh, still pretty bad. And Telemachus is like, oh good, nothing's changed. And Odysseus is like, come on, kid, man up. Why are you letting these suitors strut around your house as if they own the place? I mean, if I were, say, the king himself, returned in secret from his travels, why, I'd strut right in there and kill all of them. And Telemachus is like, yeah, you're right. It's just too bad you're not him. And then Athena's like, hey, Odysseus, I've decided you should reveal yourself to your son, and rips the illusion off of him. So Odysseus is like, hey, son, I'm home. And Telemachus is like, dad! And it's all super heartwarming. Pause for a moment to absorb the feels. So Odysseus and Telemachus start plotting their revenge on the suitors. Meanwhile, back in the castle, Penelope and the suitors, a good name for a band, by the way, learn from the swineherd that Telemachus is back, and the suitors are like, ah, damn it, our ambush has failed. Guess we better kill him right here before he can tell everyone that we tried to kill him. And Penelope is like, what? How dare you plot to kill my son? And they're like, what? No, we didn't say that. And she's like, oh, okay. So the next day, Telemachus returns to the palace, while Odysseus, once again disguised as a beggar, goes into town. So Telemachus tells Penelope about his journey, although he leaves out the part about Odysseus, and his new prophet buddy, Theoclymenus, is like, the really weird thing is, I'm getting a sense that Odysseus is here in Ithaca. And Penelope's like, man, that's just ridiculous. Meanwhile, Odysseus and the swineherd head for the palace, where the disguised Odysseus is immediately recognized by his old dog, Argos. God, this story is so adorable. Then the dog dies. Why? So beggar Odysseus begs scraps of foods from the suitors, who generally oblige, except for this one guy who throws a stool at him. So the suitors get pretty boozed up and start talking smack to Odysseus, but then Telemachus is like, sleep it off, you drunks, and they all go to bed. Then Odysseus and Telemachus put their plan into motion. First, they hide all the suitors' armor and weapons upstairs. Then Odysseus goes to talk to Penelope, who he promises that before the end of the month, Odysseus will return. Hint. Hint. Penelope asks beggar Odysseus if he thinks she should remarry, and Odysseus is like, no, I'm sure your husband will be back real soon to murder all your suitors. Don't sweat it. And she's like, man, I don't know. Tell you what. Tomorrow, I'll hold a contest among the suitors and anyone else who wants to try, and only a man just like Odysseus will be able to win and become my husband. And Odysseus is like, that's a great plan, do exactly that. So the next day, all the suitors assemble, still trying to figure out how to discreetly murder Telemachus, when Penelope unveils her secret plan. So, some context. Odysseus had this crazy strong recurve bow. It was a really cool bow, but it was a present and he never ever took it to war, so it was still locked up safely in the palace basement when he left for Troy. Now, this bow is ridiculously strong, but Odysseus never had any trouble dealing with it because, as mentioned previously, he's a badass. So Penelope's like, alright everyone, no more delays. I'll marry the man who can string this bow most easily, and then use it to shoot through these 12 axe heads. Now, this bow has a draw strength of something like 500 pounds, so none of the suitors can even bend the bow far enough to string it. And then beggar Odysseus is like, hey, just for kicks, can I have a look at that bow? And the suitors are like, sure, this is gonna be good. And then, of course, Odysseus strings the bow easily. Then he casually shoots an arrow through all 12 axes, and then it's murdering time. Odysseus reveals himself in all his glory, the suitors start panicking, and Odysseus and Telemachus engage in some healthy father-son bonding by killing nearly all of them. After wreaking bloody vengeance on his enemies, and then after a nice long bath, Odysseus is finally reunited with Penelope. Then Athena persuades the entire rest of Ithaca not to take vengeance on Odysseus for killing the entire noble population, and they all lived happily ever after.
Ugh, someone should invent an artistic improvement process that doesn't involve old work being hard to look at. Anyway, the next generation after the Trojan War was less the subject of hero stories and more of tragedies, of which only one survives intact: the Oresteia.
So, a long time ago, I said I was going to summarize the Oresteia. You know, finally tie a nice little ribbon around Agamemnon's catastrophic landslide of a personal life and close that particular chapter of Greek mytho-history. And then I just kinda didn't. I mean, I had stuff going on, like, you know, college and moving and not sleeping enough, and then drawing 300 frames for the Iliad video, and honestly, I just completely forgot about it. Which is a damn shame, because in hindsight, the Oresteia is one of the most interesting tragedies I've ever read, and the one with the most far-reaching mythological and political consequences. So first of all, some context. If you've seen my video on Iphigenia, then at first I'd like to apologize for the general quality, but more specifically, you're aware that Agamemnon rather famously sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia in order to raise the winds and set sail to the Trojan War. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the number one person most likely to be enraged by this development is Queen Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's wife and Iphigenia's mother. Fortunately for Clytemnestra, she has a whole 10 years to plot her revenge with her boyfriend Aegisthus, so that when Agamemnon returns triumphant from the Trojan War, Clytemnestra has a nice revenge scheme queued up and ready to go. Oh, and on the off chance that Agamemnon hadn't pissed her off enough yet, he also brings back a trophy concubine, the Trojan princess Cassandra, famous for being able to see the future and also for not being able to convince anyone to ever listen to her about said future. Strangely, as soon as they land, Cassandra starts yelling about how Agamemnon's about to get totally murdered, and so is she. Agamemnon's like, "Heh, women, am I right?" and is promptly murdered in the bath by Clytemnestra, who also kills Cassandra. What a twist! One thing we do have to keep in mind when we're reading this story is that in ancient Greece, murdering family was seriously not okay, regardless of the circumstances. Agamemnon got a pass for killing his daughter because the gods ordered him to, but Clytemnestra murdering Agamemnon as retaliation was considered pretty reprehensible just on principle, even though from a more modern perspective it's an almost precedented response. Now, because she wasn't related to Agamemnon by blood, Clytemnestra gets something of a pass from the gods, but the bottom line is we're really not supposed to be rooting for her. So Aegisthus takes the throne of Argos, and part 1 of the Oresteia wraps up on a high note, at least if you're Clytemnestra. So like all the best stories where the appointed bad guys win at the end of Act 1, Part 2 begins with a several-year time skip, and Clytemnestra has a nightmare about giving birth to a snake. She worries that this might be an omen that the gods are angry with her for some unknown reason, so she sends her long-suffering daughter Electra, along with a posse of slave women, to offer libations on Agamemnon's grave. Now, Electra is none too pleased with her new evil dad or her old evil mom, and neither are any of the slaves, but they don't really have a whole lot of autonomy, so they do as Clytemnestra says. And it's a good thing, too, because when she goes to the grave, Electra meets her brother Orestes, who's been exiled from Argos for several years. He's back and ready for some sick vengeance because Apollo's oracle told him he has to stab his mom for stabbing his dad. Orestes and Electra throw out some prayers to their dead dad, then concoct a plan to kill Clytemnestra and also Aegisthus just because. Orestes disguises himself as an ordinary traveler and heads up to the palace, and when Clytemnestra answers the door, he says that he's been sent to inform her that her son Orestes is totally dead. Clytemnestra is majorly bummed out by this, or at least she appears to be. It's kinda hard to tell with her. Anyway, she invites Orestes in, and he promptly navigates his way to Aegisthus, who, thanks to the machinations of the Greek chorus, is totally unguarded. Orestes promptly murders him, and when Clytemnestra comes charging in with an axe, he gets ready to kill her too. But then he's all conflicted and junk. After all, she is his mother. Clytemnestra argues with him for a few lines, but Orestes' hype man reminds him about the Apollo thing, and Orestes makes up his mind, successfully murdering Clytemnestra. So that's cool, right? Well, you know how sometimes when you're watching a cop show and the cops like zero in on the bad guy and the whole plot gets wrapped up all nice and neat, but then you check the timestamp and you realize there's like a whole 20 minutes left in the episode and you're like, oh man, there's no way something's not about to go catastrophically wrong. So Orestes promptly begins hallucinating that the Furies are torturing him for the crime of matricide, which was one of those things that you just super hella weren't supposed to do in ancient Greece. The chorus questions his sanity and Orestes runs off into the night, harried by nightmares that nobody else can see. So part 3 begins when a priestess of Apollo heads into the temple at Delphi for work one morning, at which point she sees Orestes passed out in the supplicant's chair, surrounded by the Furies, who are all asleep. As it turns out, Apollo pulled a total bro move and cast a spell on the Furies to knock him out, so Orestes can take some time to take a nap and then seek refuge in Athens. Orestes starts heading to Athens with the help of Hermes, at which point the ghost of Clytemnestra slaps the Furies awake and sends them off after him again. So Orestes has just enough time to arrive in Athens and throw out a prayer to Athena before the Furies catch up to him. Luckily for him, Athena has been keeping an eye out for him and manifests to take care of this whole mess. So Athena gets the general gist of the situation and says that this whole thing is too complicated for her to judge on her own, so it's time to establish the Athenian legal system. Yeah, so as it turns out, this whole play is basically a giant excuse to explain the Athenian judiciary system. Swerve. So Athena assembles a jury of Athenian citizens and places herself as the judge, and Apollo shows up to be Orestes' defense attorney. The Furies are deeply uncomfortable with this whole prosecution business, being better equipped to enact vigilante justice rather than actual justice, but they give it the old college try anyway. So Orestes gets cross-examined by the Furies, who get him to spill that, yes, he did indeed murder his mother, but in his defense she had it coming, and besides, says Orestes, she wasn't really his mother. If that sounded baffling, don't worry, Apollo's got you covered. See, according to Apollo, motherhood doesn't mean anything.
It's really the father that has the true claim to parenthood, and the mother is just a walking fetus incubator. Wow, that concept has not aged very well, has it? Anyway, with all the arguments made, the jury sets about voting, though Athena volunteers beforehand that she's casting her vote for Orestes. As it turns out, the jury ends up in a tie, so thanks to Athena's tie-breaking vote, Orestes is free to go. And go he does, all the way back to Argos and far, far away from the Furies so he can sort out his problems without all the crazy. Athena, meanwhile, persuades the Furies to stick around and help her out with this new legal system she's created. Rather than just punishing people with no regard for context, these new and improved Furies are only here to punish the bad people judged as such in a court of law. With their new role, the Furies are also given a new name, and are dubbed the Eumenides, meaning the kindly ones. So, long story short, the next time you're hunted down by a trio of bloodthirsty demons for the crime of intrafamilial murder or the violation of hospitality rules, make sure to request your phone call.
And after this, Greek mythology peters out into Greek history. And when looked at from this perspective, what strikes me is how obvious it is that Greek mythology is not a monolith. The first age of, not exactly heroes, but big names and major kings is mostly defined by people violating divine taboos and being smote about it. It lays down the foundations of the culture and the laws. Human sacrifice is out, divine hospitality is in. Then in the next generation, you get the age of monster slayers, powerful heroes striking out into the wilderness and overcoming the primeval nightmares that lurk in the dark, then founding cities or marrying princesses or goddesses, or flying too close to the sun and getting smote by the gods again. By the time the Argonaut generation turns up, the status quo is pretty much set. Royal lines are well and truly in place, and heroes are usually princes tasked by kings to clean up the last lingering monsters hiding in their basements or prowling around their walls. The conflict becomes increasingly interpersonal, and that comes to a head in the Trojan War, where the gods intervene, yes, but the threat is on all levels profoundly human. Human selfishness, human short-sightedness, human grief and rage and wrath, and the deeply human consequences. In the wake of the war, the royal houses are decimated. Odysseus finds himself fallen through the cracks of civilization, coming face to face with monsters and sorceresses that nobody in his generation has had to fight, and slowly, painfully making his way out so he can finally get back home. Odysseus isn't a Herculean monster slayer. In fact, he barely slays anything. That age is over. Instead of conquering the untamed world, Odysseus manages to outsmart it just enough to claw his way back to the civilization his ancestors built stone by stone, and that his generation nearly destroyed. And as the final capstone, Orestes, the heir to the cursed house of Atreus, faces untempered divine wrath as the gods both command him and punish him for obeying their decrees. But this time, the divine wrath serves a purpose. Orestes is not a cautionary tale destroyed for defying the gods, he's an edge case that proves the gods need to change. And so Athena establishes a bridge between divine and mortal justice, lays down the Athenian legal system, and the Age of Heroes comes to an end and simply becomes history. From this angle, the great heroes and founder kings and monster slayers stop resembling a pantheon of mythic superheroes embroiled in constant crossovers and cataclysmic battles, and instead start looking like steps in a lengthy process, a creation myth of how the ancient Greek world was shaped, not by its gods, but by its people. And I think that's neat. I've always thought this was neat. And if you've made it this far in the video, maybe you'll indulge me a little bit of a personal digression. Greek mythology was a very early fascination of mine, and when the channel was still very new and I was in danger of running out of Shakespeare plays, which at the time was the only thing I was summarizing, it was a very easy decision for me to branch out and start making summaries of classical Greek literature, and then branch out just a little further into summaries of individual bite-sized myths, of which I already knew plenty and had a decent idea of where to find more. It was my very first quarter of college, I was the most grown-up I'd ever been, and I was staring down the promise of 4 years of learning and improving. College would take care of my academic growth, but there was more growing I wanted to do, and I've never been good at doing just one thing. So when the idea came to me to expand the channel into something much bigger than just Shakespeare summarized, I realized I could grow as an artist by making videos. I wanted to practice my writing, which would be improved both by reading a lot more well-written stuff and by writing about it in scripts. I wanted to get better at being funny, which was another benefit of scripting. I wanted to get more confident about putting my art in front of other people, which could really only be done through exposure therapy and taking some risks about putting things online. I wanted to learn more about the literature and mythologies of the world so I could improve my own creative writing and world building by understanding what had come before me. I wanted to get more practice recording my voice and later recording my singing because I was fascinated by the idea of voice acting, and I've always liked singing. I wanted to get a lot better at drawing before I would feel comfortable starting in on the comic I'd been building up in my head for the better half of a decade. Everything I wanted to get better at, I could practice by making these videos. It was an absolute win, and every time I made a video, I got better. Not always much better, but I could feel it. Every video was a challenge, and that meant every video was improving me. But the thing is, I said I've never been good at doing just one thing. Or rather, I've never been good at doing things for just one reason. I have trouble focusing on anything just for its own sake. It's a lot easier for me to stick with something if I can tie it to something bigger. Summarizing a single story or a bite-sized myth was fun for me because the process of doing it was tied with these large-scale goals on my part. I wanted to become more skilled in every artistic pursuit that interests me. And every time I drew 100 frames for a video, or struggled to figure out how to punch up a script, or retook a line 5 times in a row, it had that good kind of burn. And it's obvious in hindsight, but I'm not great at widening my focus, so when I felt my enthusiasm start flagging, I just focused harder and harder on that growing discontent. Seriously, it took me months to figure out why I was having an increasing amount of trouble making the kinds of bite-sized summaries I used to. The art wasn't getting harder, the scripting wasn't getting more daunting, if anything, it was only getting easier with practice. It was just my enthusiasm that wasn't cooperating. The big videos, the mythological deep dives, the detailed diatribes, and the trope talks were as fun as they'd always been. Potentially even more fun, because it felt like the deeper I got into actually solid literary analysis, the more I was excited to share what I found. But every time I sat down to find a short, bite-sized myth or folktale to retell in 5 minutes of snappy comedy, the bottom dropped out of my motivation. And for the executive dysfunction girlies in the audience, you can guess what I concluded. Obviously, I just needed to apply myself harder. That's a song I've been hearing my whole life, and old habits die hard. If you don't want to do the thing, fucking do it anyway. If you can push yourself hard enough to do it once, you can push yourself hard enough to do it over and over again forever. The problem isn't the system making you push yourself, the problem is your inability to conform to it. But of course, this isn't a system. This is a channel I run with my best friend, and we make the rules. So eventually, after receiving some gentle prodding, I brought up my general malaise with Blue. I was feeling weirdly disheartened every time I worked on a myth, I couldn't figure out why it wasn't coming easily to me anymore, I didn't want to drag things down or not pull my weight on the channel, but whatever funk I was in wasn't getting better, and I could only tough it out for so long. It felt ridiculous that I was struggling with a fun thing I chose to do, but really, I was even indulging in broad-scale artistic angst about it. I thought maybe it was symptomatic of the truth that I was losing my ability to do this stuff at all, and I didn't want to outgrow being the kind of person who could make the art that I wanted to make. Art is the product of who you are as a person, and people change. Inevitably. I've felt myself change, and I've seen my art change, and I was getting this frightening uncanny valley feeling. This fear that I'd eventually become unrecognizable to myself and incapable of pretending to still be who I was before. Hitting your late 20s does crazy things to your self-perception, I think. Anyway, while we were talking about it, I mentioned what I'd remembered about the headspace I was in back when I started summarizing the myths. That appealing multitasking, the allure of constant improvement. And all of a sudden, it hit me. The problem wasn't that I was suffering some kind of artistic doom or a bardic curse that was draining my creative energy and willpower. The problem was that I had succeeded in my goal. Drawing thousands upon thousands of video frames over the course of 10 years had polished my art like I'd wanted it to. And hell, that pie-in-the-sky comic I was building my artistic skills up to had started happening. It had even started the process of traditional publication, something I literally never dreamed would happen, especially not in my early days of intense insecurity. Another thing that the channel helped me get over. The explicit goal I'd internally pinned my art to had been reached, and I hadn't even noticed. Making these small, self-contained videos no longer makes me feel like it's making me better as an artist. It feels like it's par for what I can do now, unchallenging and only as interesting as the story itself. And while the stories are interesting, that only keeps me invested until I have to start the busy work of filling out the audio and the visuals. And since that part of the process isn't inherently difficult or accomplishing additional goals for me anymore, the only thing I can use to motivate myself is the simple desire to make the video exist. And that desire is there, but it's nowhere near as strong or as consistent as the drive I had to practice and improve. I mean, hell, we just spent this whole video walking through the last 10 years of my progress, and those old videos hurt me to watch for a reason. The reason being, they worked. I don't think artists should wallow in self-criticism in front of their audience. It's the old Julia Child adage about how a cook shouldn't apologize for the meal they're serving. But while I'm not going to tell anybody that they can't like those videos, when I look back at them, the best I could do at the time, I snag on the surface-level research with mistakes I now see as obvious, the tentative and unconfident vocal delivery, the haphazard art, and the comedy that either boils down to, hey, this is kind of like that other thing, or hey, isn't this thing like so weird? Referential humor and point-and-laugh comedy are things I've moved away from because because I don't find them as funny as I did when I was 18. I wanted to make this mega video to tie all these things together, to give these disparate, bite-sized videos the larger, deeper context I find inherently interesting, because that is still fascinating to me. I love nothing more than tripping over a research rabbit hole and getting ensnared in some buck-wild wonkiness I can't wait to share with everyone. But it's these simpler stories, the easy stories, that I've started to find boring. And boredom is the one thing I've never been able to fight head on. Even if I could, I'd eventually hit the point where the video quality would suffer, and I wouldn't be able to tell when we've crossed that bridge. Hell, I might have already crossed it. When I'm struggling to make art, I have less energy to punch it up and make it just that extra layer of fun. And without that energy, I feel like the stuff I make is only sufficient, not actually good. I do know that this difficulty I'm having is very contained. Trope talks and detailed diatribes in the space of literary analysis I do is still completely in the clear. If anything, I'm having more fun with it now. And the large-scale mythological deep dives, the annual episodes of Journey to the West, the bigger videos, I still feel like I'm getting a lot out of those. Artistic angst will have you believing you're never gonna have another good idea again in your entire life, but the root of the burnout problem is usually very localized. And for me, it's just that the small, single myth videos have been giving me creative diminishing returns for a while now. And I think I gotta stop pushing myself to keep going on them just out of stubborn habit. It doesn't mean I'll never make more, it just means I need to make sure I'm having fun with it. And apparently, if things get too easy, or at least too monotonous, I stop having fun. Which is good to know about myself, I guess. I mean, I've always known my unconquerable nemeses were boredom and stagnation, and I guess no matter how much I grow as an artist, I will never grow out of being me. In any case, thanks for humoring my frankly self-indulgent walk through my own brain at the tail end of this monster of a video. If you got this far, drop a potato emoji at the end of your comment or something. Like the humble Spud, I too am excited to find new ways to grow, and some of them might hopefully taste good. Okay, first on the new to-do list, get better at metaphors.
About the things that we could be, but baby, I've been praying hard. Said no more counting dollars, we'll be counting stars. Yeah, we'll be counting stars. I see this life like a swinging vine, swing my heart across the line, and in my face is flashing signs. Seek it out and ye shall find. Oh,